Chapter 1185. He didn't attach any preset conditions to the adjustment of the rune. He didn't think about how the rune should be a part of the whole rune. He didn't think about how the whole rune should look like. He just adjusted the rune according to the direction of the rune and the mystery of the two vortexes. If there was a preset condition, it would be that the rune was not complete. Under such circumstances, such a mysterious, incomplete rune became what it was at this moment. It was like a car part that could be used to smash people before it was installed in the car, but it lost this function after it was installed in the car. This rune was previously considered to be complete. When it was considered to be complete, it had all kinds of inexplicable power and could produce all kinds of special effects. However, when this rune became a part of a huge rune, this inexplicable power and special effect disappeared. Although it was still mysterious, and the rune was still the same rune, it was only a part of a whole rune. Naturally, its performance was completely different from before. It didn't look as mysterious as before. Luo Fan looked at such a broken rune, and the amazement in his heart was hard to describe. If these vortexes were like the two vortexes he had discovered, and each vortex was in a huge space-time, wouldn't the missing part of this rune be in hundreds or even thousands of space-times? What is this rune as a whole? Why is it scattered like this? Are there really hundreds or thousands of space-times like this universe that are affected by the vortexes? Luo Fan thought to himself. His eyes stared at the tattered rune motionlessly. This rune was seriously damaged. It was so damaged that, even with Luo Fan's knowledge and cultivation, he couldn't complete it. It was impossible to make up for it completely. Even if he forced himself to deduce and complete it, the final result would be a modified rune. It would definitely be a rune that was very different from the real rune. It might even be a rune with a completely opposite nature. Such a rune was obviously useless to Luo Fan. For Luo Fan, he deduced this rune for the mystery of the vortexes. He did it for the mystery of the vortexes and the mystery of the whole vortexes. He didn't do it specifically for the use of the rune itself. Given Luo Fan's current ability, it was obviously easy for him to be omnipotent, even if it was the creation of a universe or the creation of living beings. To him, it was just a matter of thinking. Under such circumstances, unless the rune originally contained the power of a sage, he wouldn't care about such power at all. At this moment, the incomplete rune looked like this. How could Luo Fan believe that the rune itself contained the power of a sage? It was because of this consideration. Although Luo Fan knew that he could deduce a fairly complete rune by force, he didn't do so. Instead, he just looked at this broken rune and slowly comprehended the mystery behind it. Instead, he looked at the incomplete rune and slowly comprehended the mystery behind it. Even the complete runes had to be comprehended and deduced. It was quite difficult, not to mention that 99% of the rune was missing at this moment. Of course, it was even more difficult to comprehend it clearly. After waiting for a few months, Luo Fan raised his hand and patted the rune gently. The rune instantly transformed into the shadow of a mirror. The mirror was very ordinary. It looked like an ordinary bronze mirror used by ancient ladies to dress up. Its surface was flat, and there were all sorts of insects, fish, birds, and beasts carved on its back. It gave off an extremely ordinary feeling. On the other hand, 99% of the mirror was empty. It was just an illusion. Only in one corner, where the two parts did not touch, but were not too far away from each other, there were two small parts that were real and had substance. These two spots were completely made up of runes, but their surfaces were extremely smooth, and they could clearly reflect the scene in the mirror. A mirror. Luo Fan looked at the mirror in front of him. There seemed to be doubt on his face, but it also seemed like he was certain about it. He had deduced such a mirror based on the characteristics of the incomplete rune. The general image might be correct, but it might also be very different from the truth. This was like a blind person doing MOMO. The result might be exactly the same as reality, but there might also be a world of difference, forming a ridiculous situation that made people not know whether to laugh or cry. Regardless of whether it's a mirror or not, it should be an object. Who shattered it and turned it into so many vortexes that were distributed in different space-times. What's their purpose? Luo Fan thought to himself. Unfortunately, he had reached the limit of his ability to think to this extent. He had so little information that it was almost impossible for him to find the real answer. Even if he managed to get it right, he wouldn't have a way to confirm it. Just as he was about to disperse the mirror, Luo Fan suddenly thought of something. Who was the figure I saw in the forbidden zone of life in the supreme divine land? What does he have to do with this rune? Such a thought flashed through his mind. When he thought of this, Luo Fan couldn't stay any longer. He raised his hand to disperse the mirror in front of him and put away the incomplete rune. He turned around and took a light step forward. His figure instantly left the void and appeared in the world of the crystal wall. When he arrived, he found out where Saint was. However, he didn't pay any attention to this. He just smiled faintly and took another light step forward. His figure directly stepped out of the world of the crystal wall, and even the entire crystal wall system. When Luo Fan left, Saint, who was pretending to be an ordinary wizard on a certain continent in the world of the crystal wall, seemed to have sensed something and raised his head to look around. However, he didn't discover anything. This was for sure. Given Luo Fan's strength, it was impossible for him to be discovered. Given his will, even if Saint was the creator of the world of the crystal wall, it would be impossible for him to be discovered. To be able to sense that something was wrong meant that Saint's control over the world of the crystal wall was unimaginably deep. Saint didn't discover anything unusual. He thought it was just his imagination and didn't care anymore. Instead, he continued what he was doing. You want me to take you in as an apprentice? To be honest, that's impossible. Although you have the aptitude and thinking of a wizard, you're not qualified to be my apprentice. You'd better find another wizard and beg him to take you in as an apprentice. Sir Wizard, I'm willing to offer up all my family's assets. I only ask that you accept me. Please have pity on my piety. Take me in. In front of him, a young man dressed in aristocratic clothing bowed deeply and pleaded. This was an aristocrat with an extremely high status in this continent. Because he found out that Saint had carelessly used magic, he discovered Saint's extraordinary ability. Thus, he shamelessly insisted that Saint take him in as an apprentice and teach him magic. If it was in the past, towards such a shameless aristocrat, Saint would definitely not say anything. He would just slap him and turn him into minced meat. But at this moment, because this was the last time Saint would miss this world of the crystal wall, his heart was filled with warmth. His heart was filled with warmth, and his temper was naturally much better than before. His patience was also much stronger. He could actually see this aristocrat's sincerity towards magic from his shamelessness. Faced with his sincerity, Saint thought for a moment and actually changed his mind. He said, "It's impossible to take you in as an apprentice, but seeing that you're so sincere, I'll hold a magic initiation ceremony for you." Magic initiation ceremony. Hearing this, the aristocrat's eyes lit up. The magic initiation ceremony was a kind of ceremony from ancient legends. It was said that through this ceremony, one would be 10 times more powerful than meditating and constructing level 0 spells on their own. Furthermore, the chances of entering the legendary realm would also increase by 10 times. Compared to the treatment that most wizards would give their apprentices, who would only give them some pointers and let them train properly on their own, this treatment was many times better. This made him overjoyed. He felt like he had gotten a watermelon for a sesame seed. At that moment, he repeatedly bowed and thanked the god. He even begged to stay by the god's side and take care of the god's daily life. He wanted to give everything he had to the god to repay the god's kindness and to repay the god for the cost of the initiation ceremony. When Saint heard this, he could tell what this aristocrat was thinking with a glance. It was obvious that he wanted to get more benefits from him. Saint was both angry and amused. However, he did not dislike this person. Instead, he felt that this person was quite smart and knew how to grasp opportunities. This was the magical effect of first impressions. That was because God had a good impression of the little noble in front of him from his first impression. He even felt that the little noble's persistent pestering was a sign of his devotion to magic. With such a first impression, He was naturally quite tolerant of the little noble's subsequent actions and tried his best to guide him in a good direction. Just as he was about to reject this aristocrat, he suddenly had a thought. If I leave the supreme divine land, then won't everything I've created slowly disappear with the passage of time? His expression became slightly panicked. In his mind, a boundless world appeared. There were over 1,000 continents in this world. Below the continents, countless layers of the abyss in the layer of rules and laws appeared. There was also the huge crystal wall, the almost boundless supreme divine land that had undergone some subtle changes outside the crystal wall, and the even vaster universe outside the crystal wall. All of this became clearer and clearer in his mind. It also made him feel a sense of reluctance to part. Moreover, it was an increasingly intense feeling of reluctance. No, I can't let these gradually die with my departure. In an instant, Saint stopped that reluctance, and this thought appeared in his mind. This thought appeared in his mind and immediately took root there, unable to be erased. Looks like I have to leave behind an inheritance. With this thought, Saint finally made a decision. Inheritance was a method for ordinary people with short lifespans to forcibly leave traces of their existence in the world. Now, he had to ensure that Saint did not leave this universe, this world. He definitely would not be willing. After all, there were tens of billions of years of obsession there. Since he had to leave, in order to leave traces of himself in this universe, there was only one thing that Saint could do, and that was to pass on his inheritance. He would pass on everything that he had, and let others inherit everything that he had, and replace him in controlling everything that he had left behind, so that the traces of his existence could be maintained for as long as possible. He thought this through clearly. Saint changed the topic and said, "That's fine too. I also lack someone to handle some chores." He did not know when Luo Fan would open the door and let him leave this crystal wall world with him, and leave this universe. Therefore, whatever he wanted to do, he had to hurry. This aristocrat in front of him had average aptitude, but he was right in front of him, and most importantly, Saint had a good impression of him. Since this was the case, if he wanted to choose an inheritor, the best choice was naturally this person in front of him. That aristocrat had originally just wanted to fish out some fish, but when he suddenly heard Saint's words, it was as if joy had fallen from the sky. He felt as if today was his lucky day. He felt as if all the bad luck he had experienced since birth had been for the sake of today's lucky chance. He felt as if all the bad luck he had experienced since his birth had been for the sake of this lucky chance today. "What? You're not willing?" Saint frowned as he looked at the aristocrat, who was stunned with joy. "I'm willing. I'm willing. This student can't ask for more. It's my greatest honor to be able to serve teacher." He immediately climbed up the pole and called himself a student. He called Saint teacher. Saint did not stop him, tacitly agreeing to his change of address. At least he has some redeeming qualities when it comes to intelligence. He's not completely devoid of any merits, he thought to himself. But what he said was, "All right, let's go to your manor first. We still need a lot of preparations to hold the magic initiation ceremony." "Yes, teacher," the aristocrat said happily, and hurriedly invited Saint to return with him to his huge manor. This aristocrat was only young, but his title was that of a duke. He was one of the top nobles in the entire continent, so his manor was naturally huge. There were many people living in his manor. Along the way, the farmers and workers living in his manor greeted him respectfully. Because of his excitement, he actually showed a rare gentleness. This brought at least a few days of good moods to the people in his manor. "His Excellency the Duke is such a good person. He's so gentle to us tenants. We must be blessed by the goddess of fortune to have such a master." That's right, that's right. I heard that other nobles, not to mention dukes, even a small baron, would flaunt their power in their own territory, beating and scolding the tenants. Fortunately, we are the tenants of His Excellency the Duke. So, we must work hard to be worthy of His Excellency the Duke. Yes, yes, yes. If we're chased out, we won't be able to live. Such a conversation kept ringing behind the little noble and the divine after they left, showing the rare gentleness and unimaginable effect. These voices occasionally drifted into the ears of the aristocrat, greatly satisfying his vanity. He felt that his image in the eyes of his new teacher was becoming more and more impressive, and his heart was filled with joy. Seeing the aristocrat's childish behavior, Saint only felt that it was funny. After entering the manor, Saint ordered the aristocrat to prepare a secret room, as well as some materials that were not very precious, but were not commonly seen either. This aristocrat was rather influential on the continent. In just half a day, he had gathered the materials that would normally have taken 1 or 2 days and carefully delivered them to Saint. Holiness put away the materials and didn't waste any time. He began to set up the secret room. First, he drew a dense pattern in the secret room, outlining a circular but extremely complicated pattern. Next, he modified and placed the materials in special positions and activated them one by one. Because of this, the entire secret room was gradually shrouded in a colorful light. Looking at this colorful scene, the aristocrat's eyes were full of longing and shock. "I'm finally going to become a noble mage," he said to himself in his heart. After arranging the last material in a special position, Saint pointed to the middle of the room and said to the aristocrat, "Stand there." Yang said to the nobleman, "Stand there." When a young noble heard this, his heart beat 3 or 4 times faster than normal. Almost an ordinary person standing at the door could hear his heartbeat. He stumbled to the door of the secret room. In fact, if Saint was really holding the so-called magic initiation ceremony, this aristocrat would have already destroyed it. In fact, if the Holy Church was really holding a so-called magic initiation ceremony, this little noble had already destroyed the ceremony. However, it was obvious that Saint was not holding the magic initiation ceremony. If he had wanted to hold the magic initiation ceremony, he would not have needed to go through so much trouble. He would only need to pat this aristocrat lightly, and he would have obtained the ability to learn and use magic. In fact, the ceremony that Saint was holding was the bestowing of citizenship in the supreme divine land. It was a ceremony that had never appeared before, and had just been created by Saint. If this ceremony was successful, this aristocrat would no longer be a native of the Crystal Wall world. Instead, he would become a citizen of the supreme divine land on the same level as Saint's kingdom. From then on, not only would he be able to use magic at will, but he would also obtain eternal life. Chapter 1186. The reason why God had accepted this little noble as an apprentice was so that he could inherit everything he had. Of course, it wouldn't be like the usual magic initiation ceremony in the Crystal Wall world. Instead, it would just give him the right to learn and use magic. In that case, what would be the use of inheriting his everything and continuing his traces in this universe? The various materials and preparations in this ceremony of granting citizenship in the supreme divine land were actually all to create an environment similar to the birth of life. Then, with the help of the great sage of the supreme divine land, the unimaginable authority he encountered here, the minor noble was connected to the law layer that the supreme divine land had modified. Thus, he could be like the other citizens of the supreme divine land, able to use the power of the law layer and obtain eternal life because of the protection of the law layer. Of course, the process of such a ritual didn't really need to be as strict as ordinary magic initiation rituals, because the main body of the ritual was holiness, and not these materials and these arrangements. The minor noble stood in the middle of the secret room. His body was affected by a gentle force, and he began to float. At this moment, all the materials in the room released in even more intense light, turning the room into a sea of light. The minor noble felt as though he had fallen into a boundless sea of light. The light seemed to have solidified, almost like flowing water. That boundless warmth enveloped him, making him feel as if he had returned to his mother's womb. It was an indescribable sense of security. It was so comfortable that he hugged his knees in midair and fell into a deep sleep. Seeing this, Divine smiled and made a grabbing motion. The huge amount of light in the secret chamber condensed into a light cocoon in the blink of an eye. The cocoon wrapped around the minor noble like a ball of light hovering in midair. Seeing this, Zhang Xian's will of holiness surged forth. In an instant, it connected with the law layer. Following the law layer, it began to pass towards a mysterious location. What the Supreme Divine Land used to control the connection between its citizens and the law layer was not a real device, but rather a special modification to a certain part of the law layer, allowing the laws of a certain part of the law layer to obtain this kind of control. True citizens were born in the Supreme Divine Land. Then, the laws of this location would naturally send out some sort of signal to brand the new citizen, to give it the ability to have the authority to connect to the law layer. What Holiness was currently contacting was the law that held the authority to communicate with citizens on the law level. As the great sage of the transcendent divine land, his divine authority was simply too high. As soon as he transmitted his thoughts over, the nomological laws in that area immediately transmitted the signal back. In the blink of an eye, an inexplicable ripple swept over and enveloped everything in the secret room. Following that, a mark was formed directly from the undulations and directly entered the secret chamber. Inside the cocoon of light, the little noble instantly gained the ability to connect to the layers of laws at will. From then on, he obtained immortality and was no longer limited by his lifespan. It turned out that the Supreme Divine Land's law layer that controlled the citizens' access to the law layer had been completely deceived by the holy, treating this little noble as a legal citizen of the Supreme Divine Land. After doing all this, the divine saint heaved a sigh of relief. This was the first time Holiness had used the bestowal ceremony of the Supreme Divine Land citizenship. Although in theory, this method could succeed, it had not been tested, so he was not too sure whether it would work or not. Before the final result happened, he had actually been constantly prepared for what to do if this method did not work. He had even thought of 3 or 4 other methods, such as bringing the minor noble out of the gray space and rearranging it in the outside world, or bringing him to the side of a pregnant woman who was giving birth and transferring the authority over the child to the minor noble, and so on and so forth. Now that this method had succeeded on the first try, it was naturally a lot easier for him and saved him a lot of trouble. He waited like this for a few days. The cocoon of light also floated in the air for a few days. This time, a crackling sound came from within the cocoon of light. Following that, countless tiny cracks appeared on the entire cocoon of light. These cracks grew larger and more obvious, until finally it completely collapsed, turning into countless tiny fragments that scattered in all directions and gradually disappeared without trace. Only the body of a naked man curled up with his hands wrapped around his knees was left there. This man was currently a little dazed. He opened his eyes blankly and slowly stretched his body. Asterisk boom. Asterisk a loud sound rang out. And at this moment, the entire room seemed to have been stuffed into a giant object that was twice the size of the secret room itself. The 4 walls expanded in all directions from the original square to round, and then suddenly exploded, turning the entire secret room into a deep pit. Of course, this secret room did not exist. As a secret room, although it did not have to be built underground, it definitely had to be surrounded by many buildings to conceal it. The sudden change in the secret room caused more than half of the surrounding buildings to collapse in an instant. What's going on? Am I an initiate in magic? This man was, of course, the little noble. At this moment, he clearly saw the situation around him and could not help but feel bewildered. Is an initiate in magic this powerful? But the mages I've seen before didn't seem to be this powerful. He muttered to himself, raising his hand and lightly patting the ground in front of him. With a boom, the ground in front of him directly exploded, and a huge handprint appeared 3 to 4 feet deep into the ground. He looked down at his naked body and cried out in surprise. Instinctively, his hands pulled at his body, and a noble's robe appeared on his body. This change instantly threw him into a state of confusion. Could this be something special about the ancient initiation ceremony? Using this ceremony can make one so powerful. He opened his mouth and looked at his hands in disbelief. There's no need to try anymore. If you continue to destroy, your manor will be razed to the ground. At this moment, Holy's calm voice entered his ears, causing him to instantly realize that there was someone beside him who could explain what had happened to him. After landing, he looked around and saw that Holy was standing quietly at the side. Looking at his calm appearance, all the destruction around him did not affect him at all. Teacher, he instinctively used the power of the rule layer, and his body landed in front of Holy, calling out in surprise. My name is Holy. You are my student. Don't use your original name. From now on, you will be called God, Holy said calmly. God? Teacher, isn't this name a bit arrogant? The little noble, who is also God, said somewhat uneasily. Vaguely, he found that the development of the situation seemed to be very different from what he had expected. Arrogant? When you feel that this name is natural, you will truly graduate. By then, you will have truly graduated from your apprenticeship. That was very strange. God didn't know what to say. Holy didn't say much and said, let's go. We don't have much time. Learn as much as you can about these things. As he said that, with a light step, he disappeared from the manor in an instant. God didn't know what was going on, but just as he was about to ask where he had gone, he found that an invisible force had wrapped around him and instantly pulled him away. He had gone directly behind Holy. It was obvious that the divine had conveniently taken him with them when they left. The changes in the manor were so strange that the farmers, tenants, and workers were all shocked. In the following period of time, a legend began to spread in this area that a certain duke, because of his good heart, had caught the eye of some god and directly ascended to become a god. This legend spread more and more widely, and it became more and more detailed. In the end, there were almost all the details. A golden light descended from the sky, and a white-browed old god said to the duke that he had done a good deed and moved the heavens, so he had come to help him become a god. However, these were all driven by the desire of the farmers and tenants to become benevolent to their superiors. It had nothing to do with Holy and God, who had already left. After leaving the manor, Holy and God began to travel through the crystal wall world with God. During this process, they constantly taught him how to use the power of the rules and laws, changing his worldview bit by bit. At the same time, Divinity had set up many methods on his floating island. When he left, Divinity would be able to learn the knowledge of the supreme divine land according to the arrangements he had left, and thus be able to better receive the inheritance he had left behind. Here, Holy was struggling to leave traces of himself in the universe after he left. A few days ago, Luo Fan had already arrived outside the life forbidden zone, where he had stayed for thousands of years. This life forbidden zone was not much different than it was a few decades ago. It still looked like the countless lights and shadows caused by the chaos of the rules and laws. Once any citizen of the supreme divine land approached this place, his connection with the rules and laws would be affected. Therefore, at this moment, there was no trace of life within a few light years of this life forbidden zone. The whole place was like a real-life forbidden zone, or rather, a land of death. Luo Fan came to this place and looked up. He saw that a few light years away, there were some sparse buildings there. It seemed that they were exploring this place of death and studying the various secrets inside. Such a place was naturally a land of death for the residents of the supreme divine land. But for Luo Fan, it was nothing. He stepped into it without hesitation. As a Tao master of the perfection realm, wherever Luo Fan stepped was a complete world. Where he stood, the rules and laws were naturally smoothed out. At this moment, when he stepped into this place where the rules and laws were abnormal, the space around his body naturally became smooth. No matter how chaotic they used to be, no matter how unbelievably harmful they were to living beings, there would be no difference. The cultivator who appeared decades ago has appeared again. Luo Fan did not hide himself. The moment his figure appeared, the monitoring buildings in the distance reacted. Countless signals were directly transmitted from those buildings and began to move towards a certain place in the supreme divine land. Those who were watching Luo Fan. The attention of those who had suffered at the hands of Luo Fan was directed to this location. Everything that had happened in this region decades ago had become the greatest humiliation of this supreme divine land. There were so many people controlling such powerful weapons, but in the end, a single cultivator had easily killed them all. He had even completely destroyed a teleportation planet and killed a huge number of rich people. Although this was not much of a loss to the overall strength of the Supreme Divine Land, it was a huge blow to their face. It made the higher-ups of the Supreme Divine Land want to regain their face at all times. And obviously, to regain their face, they had to destroy the cultivator who made them lose face. It was precisely because of this that there was such a tight security here, so that there were citizens of the Supreme Divine Land guarding here at all times. They were always ready to spread the news. As the news of Luo Fan's arrival spread, the power of the Supreme Divine Land began to gather towards this place of death. The power that appeared this time was many times stronger than it was a few decades ago. A few decades ago, there was only one extinction ray cannon, and it was an extinction ray cannon with limited power. But now, there were 10,000 extinction ray cannons gathered at this location. Moreover, the power of these extinction light cannons was not much restricted at all, if they really went all out. Each extinction light cannon could directly destroy the space-time within a range of hundreds of millions of light years. There was absolutely no problem. Such a terrifying deterrent force when tens of thousands of extinction light cannons gathered. It was really enough to shock and frighten anyone. These extinction light cannons were distributed around this life forbidden zone in all directions, forming a huge spherical shape. Compared to the huge spherical life forbidden zone that had a circumference of 30,000 light years, these 10,000 extinction light cannons were naturally insignificant. However, the range of the firepower of these extinction light cannons was extremely wide, and the connection between them was extremely tight. They surrounded each other and formed a huge net that enveloped the place of death without any reservations. No matter who it was or when it appeared, they would be able to discover them immediately and give them a fatal blow. This time, we must kill that cultivator. Only by killing him can we wash away the humiliation we suffered. Only then can the Supreme Divine Land continue to occupy the peak of the entire universe and continue to look down on all other countries. A voice echoed on the platform above the 10,000 extinction light cannons. Each extinction light cannon had a control panel, which was the seemingly flat support surface. On it, there were some citizens of the Supreme Divine Land standing there, on alert, waiting to use the platform to deal a fatal blow to any living creature that appeared in the life forbidden zone. This is our best chance. Right now, everyone knows what is happening in the universe. The self-evolving cultivation civilization is emerging. The so-called cultivation country is expanding wantonly and is challenging the dominance of our technological civilization. The entire universe is in a moment of life and death. We must gather the confidence of all our people. We must let them know that a technological civilization is not something that a cultivation civilization can compare to. The power of a technological civilization is still the ruler of the entire universe. The voice was extremely impassioned, and it echoed in the ears of many citizens. Over the past few decades, the situation in the entire universe had become increasingly grim. At the very least, this was the case for the beings of the technological civilization. The terrifying changes that had taken place in the cultivation country over the past few decades shocked all beings in the universe who could observe the changes in that location through various means. As a result, they gradually let go of their rejection of cultivators and gradually began to feel that cultivators could control such a terrifying power. Furthermore, they were the ones who controlled such a terrifying power. It was this feeling that caused the citizens of the Supreme Divine Land to show signs of approaching the cultivation civilization. Over the past few years, the higher-ups of the Supreme Divine Land had executed tens of thousands of such citizens. In the past few months, the situation had become even more serious. It was unknown what had happened in the past few months, but the laws of the entire universe seemed to have undergone some inexplicable changes. Some of the citizens of the supreme divine land did not need the legacies of cultivators, nor did they need other cultivators to enlighten them. They were able to comprehend cultivation methods on their own and directly embark on the path of a cultivation civilization. From then on, they established cultivation organizations within the supreme divine land, banded together, and either fought against the machinery of the state or fled the supreme divine land to join the cultivation country. Although the supreme divine land reacted extremely quickly to such drastic changes, it was like trying to wrap a fire with paper. No matter how hard they tried, they could not stop it. When those cultivators killed one, two would appear. When they killed two, four would appear. Just like this, in just a few months, the entire supreme divine land had fallen into a precarious situation that could collapse at any time. It was precisely because the supreme divine land had become so dangerous that the higher-ups of the supreme divine land naturally would not let go of such an opportunity to unite the hearts of the people and let everyone see the power of the technological civilization. This was why they had gathered so much power to come here and kill the cultivator who dared to return. If it was not for this reason, how could the supreme divine land have produced so many light cannons? After all, the power of a single light cannon was enough to turn the entire forbidden zone into a land of death. Even if the cultivator seemed to be very relaxed back then, it should be enough if the number of light cannons was increased by 100 times. Even if they wanted to be safe, they could increase it by 1,000 times. Why would they need to increase it by 10,000 times? Therefore, the main reason they had increased so much was not to kill the cultivator, but to demonstrate their power and unite the hearts of the people. Chapter 1187. Now, everyone, pay full attention. Once that cultivator appears, open fire immediately. No need to ask for instructions. Attention! Once you find that cultivator, open fire immediately. No need to ask for instructions. No need to ask for instructions. This voice was repeated several times. With this voice, a murderous aura shrouded this area. Many of the annihilating light cannons began to gather power and were ready to be fired at any time to bombard any abnormalities that might appear in the lifeless land ahead. Luo Fan did not care about what happened after that. Everything that happened outside of this land of death was vivid in his mind. Every bit of change was reflected in his mind, allowing him to sense it with great ease. He did not care about those cannons that were pointed at him. Although the power of these annihilating light cannons was so terrifying that it could even destroy the world, it was really nothing to him. He could make those annihilating light cannons completely lose their effectiveness with a sweep of his mind. This was the difference between technological creations and artifacts refined by cultivators. The more sophisticated and powerful a technological creation was, the more fragile it would be. As long as a necessary part was slightly damaged in the necessary place, this technological creation could destroy the entire universe, and it would no longer be able to play its role. Generally speaking, technological creations were very concerned about the defense of their bodies, and their defense was very tight. However, that level of defense was generally only effective against attacks from the outside. It was generally impossible to defend against attacks from the inside. Before becoming a town master of the exceptional realm, Luo Fan had no way to deal with technological creations that were too powerful. If he carefully sensed it, he would be able to find its weakness. However, with his attainments in science and technology, it would take some time for him to find the weakness of a technological creation that he had never seen before. And this bit of time was enough to determine the outcome of a battle. Therefore, in the past, before he reached the exceptional town master, although Luo Fan knew this weakness of technological products, he could not make use of it in battle. He could only face it as if it were a cultivator's attack, and attack these creations. He used his super strength and unimaginably mysterious means to defeat these creations. But at this time, the situation was already different. Now, he had become a town master of the exceptional realm. This was everything in the universe. He could sense it all the time. As for those technological creations, he had already sensed it long ago, whether it was the exterior or the interior of the technological creation. in response to such a reaction. Over time, he didn't even need to actively think about it to know the weaknesses of these technological creations. For example, at this moment, the 10,000 annihilation cannons might be able to unleash a power that was strong enough to annihilate a star domain that spanned hundreds of millions of light years. But to him, he only needed to sweep his mind, and the 10,000 annihilation cannons would instantly become useless. They would not be able to unleash any of their power, let alone threaten him. In the face of such a threat, how could Luo Fan be nervous? How could he have any thoughts of caring? At this moment, Luo Fan had already traversed a distance of more than 10,000 light years and arrived at the center of this land of death. He saw a huge humanoid shadow lying on its side. At this moment, the humanoid shadow in this position was more obvious than what Luo Fan had seen last time. The reason was obvious. There was not much difference between the inside of the humanoid shadow and the outside on the surface. Only Luo Fan could sense that there was a humanoid shadow there by sensing it. But at this moment, the difference between the inside and the outside of the humanoid shadow had reached an incredible level. Inside the humanoid shadow, the space-time was extremely calm, as if it was a very ordinary space-time. But outside this humanoid shadow, there was an indescribable chaos on the rule layer. This chaos caused the outside space-time to show all kinds of incredible scenes. It seemed that all kinds of scenes that might appear in the void of the universe were compressed and overlapped together. It also seemed that all the possible scenes on the surface of a normal planet were overlapped together. Such a chaotic scene and the calm scene inside the humanoid shadow were like two completely different extremes. These two extremes made the dividing line between the two extremely clear. At this moment, if an ordinary person were to come here, they would definitely be able to see the shadow of the giant lying on its side, as if it was sleeping. It was not like before, where Luo Fan had to distinguish the difference between the inside and the outside through his own perception to be able to sense the existence of the shadow. Looking at this figure, Luo Fan could not help but sigh with emotion. His cultivation realm was originally stuck at the peak of the profound realm of Tao Master, but he just happened to make a breakthrough in this humanoid shadow. Inside this humanoid shadow, he crossed the barrier between the profound realm and the exceptional realm of Tao Master, and achieved the exceptional realm of Tao Master at this moment. Thus, his strength was many times stronger than before. Who are you? Why are you here? This thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind as he looked at the humanoid shadow lying on its side in front of him. He raised his right hand, and a tattered rune appeared on his palm. This rune was complicated and mysterious. In Luo Fan's opinion, only the way of the sage, the figure of the sage, and the shadow of the sage could compare with it. However, such a rune was so broken that it was less than 1% of the original rune. In addition to this rune, there were more than 100 runes of the same scale and complexity combined together, which hindered the possibility of forming a real, complete rune. Every time he thought of this, Luo Fan could not help but feel an inexplicable shock. It can't be formed by a primordial spirit treasure being broken, can it? Suddenly, such an absurd thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. In Luo Fan's view, the cultivation artifacts were divided into 5 levels, namely, the Celestial Device, the Immortal Treasure, the Primordial Unity Treasure, the Daluo Heaven Treasure, and the Chaotic Spirit Treasure. Among them, the Celestial Device. According to the different levels of restrictions, it was divided into many small levels. Because the levels were too low, there was no need to think about it. The 4 levels above the Immortal Treasure were the Magic Treasures. Among them, the Immortal Treasure was a magic treasure that had just become a magic treasure. In this universe, it was called the Immortal Treasure. The Primordial Unity Treasure was a magic treasure of the Primordial Pure Yang level in this universe. And the Daluo Heaven Treasure, compared to the other magic treasure levels, that was an extremely huge realm, and the range it encompassed was unimaginably large. Among them, the magic treasure that had just become a Daluo Heaven Treasure was a magic treasure at the Great Perfection level. Above this magic treasure at the Great Perfection level, There were many magic treasures that were beyond the great perfection level. They were at the perishing level, the void enlightenment level, the Tao integration level, the transcendent level, and the Tao master level magic treasures. These 5 magic treasures were beyond the great perfection level. In fact, they were still at the level of the Daluo heaven treasure. That was to say, the levels of the Daluo heaven treasure, as far as Luo Fan knew, were divided into 6 small levels. The great perfection level, the perishing level, the void enlightenment level, the Tao integration level, the transcendent level, and the Tao master level. Although these 6 levels were called small levels, in fact, the gap between any 2 small levels was greater than the gap between the magic treasure and the Daluo heaven treasure. The gap was not 1 or 2 times, but 10 times, 100 times, or even 1,000 times. This was the level of all the magic treasures that Luo Fan could refine now. Above these magic treasures, there seemed to be several magic treasures that were also Daluo heaven treasures, but above the Tao master level. However, that was beyond the scope of Luo Fan's understanding. Or it could be called a half-sage magic treasure or a magic treasure with steps. Above the great overarching heaven treasure was the primordial origin spiritual treasure. The chaotic origin spiritual treasure was a magic treasure of the sage level. Each of the chaotic origin spiritual treasures was equivalent to a sage. Each of these magic treasures was immortal, indestructible, and could walk on the chaos as if it were flat ground. They could exist outside the world forever. They were omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipotent. If any creature could get one of them and refine it, he would gain the same power, the same characteristics, the same immortality, the same immortality, the same immortality, the same immortality, the same ability to walk on the chaos as if it were flat ground, and the same ability to exist outside the world forever. Even with the help of this magic treasure, one could become omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipotent. However, this was only what it showed. Its essence would not be much different from what it was before. As long as it lost the chaotic origin spiritual treasure, it would be instantly beaten back to its original state and completely lose all its power. Moreover, more importantly, how could an chaotic origin spiritual treasure, which was equivalent to the sage level, yield to an ordinary person and let an ordinary person refine it? Even if the chaotic origin spiritual treasure wanted to let an ordinary person refine it, it was impossible for the ordinary person to leave the brand in the core of the chaotic origin spiritual treasure. This was, in fact, a paradox. If an ordinary person refined this chaotic origin spiritual treasure, they could obtain supreme power. The power and characteristics they displayed were close to that of a sage. However, if one wanted to refine a chaotic origin spiritual treasure, they needed a magical power that was close to that of a sage. And with this magical power, why would they need to refine a chaotic origin spiritual treasure to obtain a power that was close to that of a sage? In fact, Luo Fan had seen a lot of semi-sage level magic treasures. Back at Wu Daozi's Taoist rite, Qilin Cliff, he saw many disciples of the sage besieging the Mad Battle Sun, who was later known as the Divine Battle Sun. In the process, the semi-sage level magic treasures fluttered in front of him, and their power was incisively and vividly stimulated, displaying the most powerful power of these magic treasures in front of Luo Fan. This allowed Luo Fan to know what a semi-sage level magic treasure looked like and how it behaved. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan was quite familiar with semi-sage level magic treasures. He knew that if the rune in front of him was complete, it would definitely be more mysterious than any semi-sage level magic treasure he had seen before. This made him guess that this rune might be a fragment of a chaotic spiritual treasure. It shouldn't be possible. A chaotic origin spiritual treasure is equivalent to a sage. It is indestructible, immortal, omniscient, and omniscient. How could it be broken into so many fragments and suppressed in so many space-times? This is definitely just a semi-sage level magic treasure. At most, it is more powerful than an ordinary semi-sage level magic treasure. Luo Fan shook his head and denied his unreliable guess in his heart. The more powerful one was, the more one could feel the power of a sage. The more one could understand the fundamental reason why the Earth universe respected sages. Luo Fan was no exception. Although he was not afraid because of this, he was more aware than ever of the power of a sage. He knew how huge the gap between him and a sage was. Therefore, he did not dare to believe that the rune he could sort out might be a fragment of a chaotic spiritual treasure. Go. After collecting his thoughts, Luo Fan raised his hand and sent the broken rune in his hand towards the huge humanoid shadow lying on its side in front of him. The place where he was standing at this time was actually quite a distance away from the giant shadow lying on its side. In fact, there were also layers of chaotic space-time barriers between them. However, Luo Fan's gentle sending of the rune, it directly allowed the three-dimensional rune to transcend space-time. It broke through the barrier of the chaotic laws and principles and directly rushed into the human-shaped shadow lying on its side. The moment the broken rune rushed into the humanoid shadow, the shadow suddenly shook slightly. Then, a gentle breathing sound rang out of thin air. It penetrated space-time. It penetrated the chaos of the laws and laws. It overcame the environment where there was no medium for transmission and directly entered Luo Fan's ears. This breathing sound was so familiar to Luo Fan. The moment he heard this breathing sound, he could not help but feel an inexplicable sense of familiarity. Recalling his various experiences in the past 1,000 years, the changes of the birth and death of countless worlds naturally emerged in his mind. Faced with this, Luo Fan could not help but show a faint smile on his face. He cast his gaze on the broken rune, only to see that the rune in the humanoid shadow seemed to be suddenly activated by some kind of power. An inexplicable brilliance began to appear on the rune, and it began to flow along the lines on the rune. Although the rune was broken, it was, after all, an unimaginably mysterious and terrifying rune. The brilliance on it flowed everywhere. Although it was quite fast, it was not that easy to completely flow. After waiting for more than an hour, the entire broken rune finally lit up. Although the light had already lit up the entire rune, the spreading of the light did not stop there. Instead, it began to spread in all directions along the rune's broken edges. It began to outline the other parts of the rune where it was originally broken and missing. The missing part, the part that Luo Fan could not comprehend for the time being. Looking at this change, Luo Fan's eyes revealed a look of shock. Although he had expected that the rune would have some changes after entering the humanoid shadow, he never dared to think that the rune would actually gradually be completed after entering the shadow. It turned out to be like this. It seems that the relationship between this person and this broken magic treasure is much closer than I thought. Luo Fan thought as he gradually calmed down his state of mind. After accepting such a setting, what was happening in front of him was actually understandable. This humanoid shadow was obviously a trace left behind by an extremely powerful cultivator, most likely a powerful cultivator who had set foot on the peak of the 9th step, who had fallen asleep here. As for that cultivator, it was very likely that he had cultivated some kind of cultivation method similar to the Tao, confirming through dreams. Thus, even though he had only left behind a projection, it was still tainted with his aura and contained the supreme mysteries of his cultivation. This kind of supreme mystery had even directly pushed Luo Fan's cultivation realm through the bottleneck and into the exceptional realm of Town Master. This was enough to show what level this mystery had reached. It was not surprising that such a level of profoundness could affect the rune and complete it. Looking at the rune that was constantly lighting up and becoming complete, Luo Fan's mind was surging. He constantly imprinted the increasingly complete rune in the depths of his memory, and constantly constructed the growing rune in his mind. The speed at which the light on the rune circulated and spread was much slower than before. Previously, it only took him more than 2 hours to completely cover the original part of the rune. But now, more than 2 hours had passed, and the part of the rune that had been added was less than 1/10 of the original part. It's so slow. According to this speed, It will take more than 20 hours to complete the part of the rune that is equivalent to the original line. If I want to completely replenish the entire rune, it will take at least 1,000 hours. This is only possible under the condition that the speed of replenishment will not become slower and slower as it gets closer to completion. Luo Fan secretly measured the speed of replenishing the rune, and such a thought appeared in his mind. A day and a night were 24 hours, and more than 1,000 hours were more than 100 days, which was more than 3 months and less than 7 months. I hope I can finally complete this rune. Thinking so, Luo Fan slowly sat down cross-legged in the air. It was naturally a great thing for Luo Fan to obtain runes that were far more than those of the half-sage magic treasures he had seen in more than 3 months and less than 7 months. Chapter 1188. Time flew by. In the blink of an eye, 10 years had passed. In the past 10 years, the broken rune had been growing, but it was 30 to 40 times slower than the 3 to 7 months that Luo Fan had calculated at the beginning. The reason for this was very simple. As time passed, the speed of the rune inside the human-shaped shadow became more and more complete, but its speed also became slower and slower. At first, it only took 20 hours to complete a rune that was equivalent to the original rune. However, after 1 or 2 months, one might not even be able to complete 1,000th or even 1/10,000th of the original rune. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan waited for 10 years, and the rune was only 99% complete. Compared to the broken rune back then, it had grown by almost 100 times. However, at this stage, there was no sign of the rune accumulating and continuing to be complete. It was as if the silhouette had reached the limit of what he could do. So that's how it is. Luo Fan sighed. He raised his hand, and the huge rune fell into his hand. The rune formed the shape of a mirror at this moment. The entire rune's surface was smooth and beautiful. Light and shadow flowed on it, but it could not be stabilized at all. It could not show anything meaningful for Luo Fan to see. In the center of the mirror, there was a small gap that was about 1% the size of the mirror. Through the edge of the gap, Luo Fan could see the countless densely packed lines inside the mirror. That was the true appearance of the rune. In contrast, the smooth and unadorned bronze mirror in front of him was an illusion created by the rune. It was a scene formed by the power of the rune itself, which naturally triggered the changes in the outside universe. The speed at which the light spread was extremely slow. In fact, if an ordinary person were to come here, they would probably give up on the thought of continuing to wait for a few months because they couldn't see clearly that the runes were being completed and growing. However, for an existence at Luo Fan's level, as long as the light continued to grow, complete, and spread, no matter how slow, even if he walked less than a millimeter in millions of years, he would be able to see and distinguish the changes as clearly as if they were visible to the naked eye. At this moment, the reason why Luo Fan had put away the rune was because he was very curious. The reason was that he didn't see the light spreading at all. It was impossible to see that the rune was being completed, even if it was a millimeter in millions of years. None at all. Under such circumstances, even if the rune was becoming complete, even if the rune was being completed at a slower speed, it would still be completed. Luo Fan didn't want to wait any longer. At this moment, although the location where the rune was missing was only about 1%, it was precisely this 1% that if every single line was extended, the length would probably be calculated in light years. With such a large number of missing lines, if they grew at a speed of less than a millimeter in billions of years, the time it would take for him to become complete would probably exceed the limit of numbers. Although Luo Fan had an eternal lifespan, he did not believe that this humanoid shadow would wait for him for so many years. Therefore, at this moment, he could only put away the rune. Moreover, Luo Fan had another way to complete the rune. That was through his wisdom, cultivation, and knowledge. He could comprehend what the missing part of the rune should look like. Then, he could mend the rune and make it perfect and flawless. In fact, this was the method that ordinary cultivators used to make up for the missing parts of the rune. When Luo Fan first obtained a rune, his first thought was to use this method to complete the rune. The reason why he didn't do this in the beginning was that he needed to find a figure lying on the side to insert the rune into it, so that the owner of the shadow could use the remaining mysteries to complete the rune. It was because the rune was missing too much, and if he tried to deduce it with his own wisdom, he would only get a plausible result. Therefore, he had no choice but to do it. It was like a blind man touching an elephant. Knowing the shape of a small piece of elephant skin, it was impossible to deduce the elephant's true appearance. But now, the situation was different. Right now, this rune was like an elephant that already knew 99% of its appearance. It was only natural for him to deduce what the remaining 1% looked like. Of course, compared to deducing the appearance of an elephant, deducing the complete appearance of this rune was hundreds of millions of times more difficult. Even if he knew 99% of the runes, it would still take him more than a year or two to complete it. Although the rune itself wasn't perfect, it was still 99% complete. At this moment, he could already exert a lot of its power. With a thought, Luo Fan poured his magic power into the rune that looked like a mirror. In an instant, the light and shadow that appeared on the surface of the rune changed wildly. In the blink of an eye, it condensed into a dense text. These texts were so many that it was hard to imagine. Little by little, it was actually the nature of the magic power that Luo Fan poured into it, including the structure of the magic power, the power that was used to temper the magic power, the process of the tempering, and how many years, months, days, hours, quarters of an hour, and how many moments had passed since its birth. There were even the mental cultivation method that should be used to cultivate such power, and what the route of the power should be. Just by looking at this text, one could roughly guess everything that Luo Fan's avatar had experienced since he started cultivating. Luo Fan looked at the words above, and the expression on his face became extremely complicated. There was shock. There was also joy. Naturally, he was shocked because the power of the rune was so incredible. With just a little bit of his magic power, it was actually able to deduce so many of his secrets. This kind of deduction ability, even he was far inferior. What made him happy was that the rune had fallen into his hands. At this very moment, he was the owner of the rune. After reading all the words, Luo Fan breathed a sigh of relief. It's all right. It was unable to deduce the fundamental worldview that allowed me to cultivate this power. It would be incredible if he could even know this. Such a thought flashed through his mind. With a light wave of his hand, the words on it instantly disappeared, reverting back to its original state. It was as if there were countless strange lights and shadows constantly flashing. But its appearance could not be fixed, it seems. With that in mind, he stowed the mirror-like rune into his universe concealment sleeve. Although the rune was just a rune, it did not contain any power. It did not contain any power, but due to its profundity, it had already affected the universe, changing the laws and regulations, changing time and space, and naturally manifesting a real entity. Naturally, he could deal with it as if it was a real entity. After putting away the rune, Luo Fan lifted his foot and lightly strode forward. His figure seemed to be moving at a slow speed as he shuttled back and forth in this extremely chaotic area. Not long after, his figure had already traversed a distance of more than 10,000 light years, directly arriving at the edge of this land of death. Over the past 10 years, the people of the supreme divine land who guarded this place had been waiting impatiently. 10 years was not a short period of time for living beings in other countries, but for the people of the supreme divine land who had eternal life and were not limited by the lifespan of living beings, it was not considered a long period of time. Usually, when they were interested, it was normal for them to play a game for 10 years. However, this did not mean that it was easy for them to wait here for 10 years. First of all, waiting here was not what they were interested in. They would not enjoy it as if they were playing a game and feel that time passed extremely quickly. On the contrary, because they were waiting for a battle, every second seemed especially long. It would be strange if they were not annoyed after waiting for 10 years. Secondly, they had to be vigilant at all times during these 10 years. Who knew if the cultivator would appear in the next moment? If they were anxious for a few years, and failed to seize the opportunity when the cultivator appeared due to a moment of carelessness, it would be unacceptable for any citizen of the supreme divine land. Moreover, there was another important reason. They could not see the end at all. They did not know how long they would have to wait. Would the outcome be out in the next moment, or would they have to wait for hundreds or thousands of years? That cultivator stayed here for 1,000 years last time. He won't do it again, right? This thought often appeared in everyone's mind. Over the past 10 years, the situation in the supreme divine land had become more and more severe. 10 years ago, those cultivation organizations were only hidden underground and spread like illegal organizations. However, after 10 years, those cultivation organizations had already colluded with many of the higher-ups of the supreme divine land, and it was almost semi-public now. Almost every cultivation organization used many hidden methods to find out the truth with just a little thought. They set up various external organizations in various parts of the supreme divine land to recruit members. Because of this, the members of the supreme divine land who hated cultivators could not do anything to them. Even if there was conclusive evidence and they applied, the higher-ups would not pay attention to them. Because of this situation, the supreme divine land was on the verge of exploding. The patience of the citizens who hated cultivators had almost reached the limit. As long as the fuse was lit, it could be detonated, and they would begin to fight against those cultivators themselves. At the same time, those cultivation organizations had almost used up their patience. Although the situation was getting better and better for them, cultivation organizations could only be semi-public after all. Even when recruiting members, they had to be extremely vigilant. If they were not careful, they could fall into a situation where their organization was almost wiped out. How could such a life be good for them? Due to this contradiction, the supreme divine land was almost like a barrel of explosives placed at the mouth of a volcano. It could be detonated at any time, and it could be blown to pieces at any time. The situation of the supreme divine land was so serious. In comparison, the situation outside the supreme divine land was only slightly better. That was a cultivation country comparable to a superpower, and its strength was expanding extremely fast. Although the territory did not improve much in the last 10 years, who knew how many billions of living beings who were interested in cultivation had thrown themselves into the cultivation country to seek their own evolution and to push the universe into the abyss of destruction. For these existences who hated cultivators the most around this land of death, such a scene was truly a torment every second. At this moment, they only had one hope in their hearts, and that was to kill the cultivators who had entered this land of death. Then they would spread the news that they had been killed. That would give their companions who hated cultivators more confidence. That would give their compatriots who had thrown themselves into the cultivation organizations a sudden awakening and turning to the light. Although some wise people actually knew how small the possibility was, they still had this one and only hope. They could only deceive themselves. With this kind of background, Luo Fan had completed the rune to 99%. His figure leisurely walked out from the direction he had originally entered. He's here. He's here. Fire. Fire. There's no need to ask for instructions. Fire directly. Quick. 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 A loud roar echoed in the universe. Following this voice, the 10,000 extinction cannons lit up one after another and began the final activation process. The 10,000 extinction cannons formed a very tight encirclement. There were extinction cannons guarding in every direction. No matter where Luo Fan left this land of death, the operators of the extinction cannons would discover his existence. After these operators discovered him, they would naturally spread his location so that the other operators of the extinction cannons would also know where he was. In other words, as long as Luo Fan appeared, it would not take more than a few seconds for the operators of the extinction cannons to discover his location. They would then aim the cannons at him and fire. In this way, from the time when the first operator discovered his location to the time when all the extinction cannons were fired, there would obviously be a time lag. This was the fundamental reason why the extinction cannons were only lit up one after another and not all lit up at the same time. The power of the annihilation ray cannon was extremely terrifying. If tens of thousands of light cannons were to hit Luo Fan at the same time, although he wouldn't die, he would still receive an extremely powerful impact. Even the three-dimensional talisman that was protecting him might be broken due to the strong impact, which would bring him some injuries that were neither too big nor too small. If there was no other way, Luo Fan naturally would not care about this. However, at this moment, he obviously had a simpler way. Seeing that the extinction cannons were starting to light up and were about to be fired at any time, Luo Fan only smiled and a thought flashed across his mind. In an instant, all the extinction cannons stopped moving, and then all the light exploded on the spot before they could even be used. At the same time, all the extinction cannons exploded on the spot, and at the same time, all the operators on the control platform above the extinction cannons were completely engulfed. The extinction cannons could even cause the nomological layer to explode and even cause fluctuations in the void. How could these citizens of the supreme divine land, who could only borrow the power of the nomological layer, resist it? In an instant, all of them did not even have the time to scream. All of them were instantly turned into nothingness and died a violent death. The power of the extinction cannons was extremely powerful. Although it was not fully activated, the power that could destroy the extinction cannons could not be much weaker. In an instant, the nomological layer around the extinction cannons was crushed, causing the nomological layer that had been modified by the supreme divine land to instantly become extremely fragmented and chaotic. Countless unbelievable lights and shadows appeared in these 10,000 areas, turning them into a death zone that was similar to the death zone in the center. From afar, the huge death zone in the center looked like a planet, and the surrounding 10,000 death zones were satellites that were evenly distributed in every direction around the planet. Moreover, they were artificial satellites. The process of the creation of the 10,000 death zones had a considerable impact on the nomological layer. Although Luo Fan was quite far away from the 10,000 death zones, he could still feel the terrifying fluctuations produced by the collapse of the nomological layer. And the huge death zone with a radius of 30,000 light years in the center became even more chaotic because of the terrifying tremors that occurred in the nomological layer. It was like a piece of mud that was already damaged. The more you shook it, the greater the damage would become, and the harder it would be to clean up. This might be the fuse. Such a thought flashed in Luo Fan's mind. Although he was in this death zone, he knew everything that was happening in the Supreme Divine Land. Naturally, he knew that the Supreme Divine Land was only one step away from a real war. It was just a fuse. Chapter 1189. The reason why the citizens who hated cultivators lost their patience was because of despair. They despaired that not even tens of thousands of annihilating light cannons could kill a cultivator, and instead, they were killed by that cultivator. Please remember the website of this website. The reason why those cultivation organizations lost their patience was naturally because they felt that the time had come. Since both sides had lost their patience, it was only natural that a war would break out. The development of the matter was just as Luo Fan had expected. This time, what happened in this place of death became the fuse for the war that broke out in the Supreme Divine Land. The Supreme Divine Land was the most powerful superpower in the entire universe. Once it caught a cold, the entire universe would sneeze. The war that broke out in the Supreme Divine Land spread to the entire universe at an unimaginable speed, causing the entire universe to fall into chaos in the next few years. An astonishing cosmic war broke out, causing the entire universe to fall into chaos. Fortunately, although the superpowers were hostile to each other and wanted nothing more than to completely erase each other from the universe, they were still rational after all. Although the war was intense, none of the technological creations that could trigger the destruction of the entire universe. This caused the war to be extremely intense and terrifying, so much so that even galaxies were shattered and space-time was torn apart. However, the ones that were usually destroyed were only high-level countries and countries below this level. However, no superpower had perished in this war. If they were rational enough, of course, it could not be a matter of life and death that would make them want to perish together. In this way, They obviously could not force them to their deaths. This was also the tacit understanding that superpowers had in a war. Naturally, Luo Fan did not care much about this terrifying war that happened in this universe. After leaving that place of death, he had already traversed countless light years in the blink of an eye and arrived in the sacred Crystal Wall world. He directly appeared at the end of this endless abyss and arrived in front of that huge whirlpool. Looking at the whirlpool in front of him, it still looked as grand as ever. At this moment, Luo Fan was still extremely shocked by such a vast and unbelievably huge door. However, he could already vaguely grasp the veins within and see some ways to open this door and enter the world behind it. If I want to open this door and use a powerful force to break through it, I would need at least a cultivator who has reached the third step to explode with all his strength. Even me, in this aspect, I'm slightly inferior. Such a thought flashed through his mind. The reason why he was able to see this was because he had also been memorizing that rune, which was constantly being completed for the past 10 years. This vortex was only one of the many parts that the rune had broken into. The mysteries contained within it were naturally contained within the rune as a whole. Although Luo Fan had only comprehended the rune with a 99% completion rate, it had already encompassed the mystery of the vortex before him. In such a situation, love, it was normal for him to know how much strength he needed to use to break open the door. Of course, the runes were too complex, and the time Luo Fan had obtained them was too short. It was only a short 10 years. In such a short period of time, he wanted to fully comprehend the mysteries of these runes. Of course, that was impossible. Therefore, he only knew how much strength he should use to open the door. He still didn't know how to open it without using a powerful force. However, just because he didn't know about it now didn't mean that he would never know. Luo Fan was already prepared for this. He raised his hand and took out a mirror that was missing a small area in the center from the cosmos withdrawing sleeve. Following that, he made a grabbing motion and grabbed a strand of energy from the vortex and poured it into the mirror. This mirror was none other than the rune that had been repaired to 99% of its original state. It was also a part of the entire vortex. The moment the power was poured into the rune, the entire rune trembled slightly, and a corner of the rune suddenly lit up. Sure enough, it's feasible. Luo Fan saw this. An inexplicable smile appeared on his face. After the power surged into the rune, the area that lit up was none other than the place that Luo Fan had first comprehended from the vortex, the place where the tattered rune was located. This was actually very normal. The power that made up the vortex could be attracted and fixed by the vortex formed by the tattered rune. This meant that the power was extremely compatible with the tattered rune itself. Under such circumstances, when the power was poured into the huge rune, it would naturally move closer to the part of the rune that was most compatible with it. That part of the rune kept lighting up and changing continuously. Following that, the light began to swim, completely fixing the ever-changing light and shadow on the mirror, and a large number of words appeared. These words were densely packed, and they clearly explained the origin of the power in detail. They clearly explained the various mysteries and functions of the rune that was compatible with the power. Among them, there was an emphasis on the possibility that the rune could communicate with a certain source of power, thereby distorting space-time, forming a space-time passage, and condensing a huge space-time door. Seeing this, Luo Fan was overjoyed. He raised his hand and grabbed an even more powerful force from the vortex, pouring it into the rune. The scene that happened once before happened again. A corner of the rune began to light up, and then the number of words increased by several times. There was a lot more content in these words, most of which supplemented and strengthened the many things that were previously described. Among them, there was even a description of the space-time passage and analysis of the space-time door. Among them, there were 30 ways to open the door. Among them, the crudest and least technical one was the one that Luo Fan had seen before, which was to use a violent impact of power to forcibly break open the door. The most exquisite and least energy-consuming method was to directly change one's body, adjusting the fluctuations and power of one's body to an extremely subtle level. The extremely profound level would make the door treat him as a part of the door, and thus naturally bypass the obstruction of the door and directly pass through it. Apart from these two methods, the other 28 methods were in between the two. Some were to refine Dharma treasures and integrate the mysteries of certain runes, and then directly control the Dharma treasures to rush through the door. Some were to cultivate Dharma treasures and directly transform them into a key to open the door, and so on and so forth. All sorts of methods made Luo Fan's eyebrows dance with delight, and he felt that his horizons had been greatly broadened. Changing one's aura is the most exquisite method. There's no need to waste time cultivating Dharma treasures, blood bond refining, and it doesn't need to consume too much power. It's just that the method of changing one's aura is somewhat complicated, and the requirements for control are too high. There are trillions of changes in every instant. Apart from me, even the sky maiden can't control it, let alone the sacred. Luo Fan frowned as he pondered. Of course, the sky maiden would accompany him through the door and enter the world that might be the demon realm. There was no need to explain this. As for why he had to consider the sacred, it was because he had promised the sacred. He wanted to bring him over. If possible, Luo Fan was rather concerned about keeping his promise. Putting them away might be a way. Luo Fan thought for a while and made a decision. The law of the trillions of changes in aura in every instant was too complicated, and the test of control was too high. He believed that if the Sky Maiden had sufficient time, she would definitely be able to do it. However, this sufficient time might be tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, or even millions of years. If it was something else, wasting this period of time was naturally nothing. However, in order to pass through the door, it was clearly too much of a waste of time. No normal person would do this. As for the sacred, there was no need to mention it. Luo Fan did not have much confidence that he would be able to learn it. If he forced himself to make contact, if he could do this, he might need to spend at least tens of thousands of times more time than the Sky Maiden to have a slight possibility of success. If the time was less than this multiple, he could not even think about it. Obviously, Luo Fan would not wait for such a long time for him. Therefore, the method that Luo Fan could choose. It was very obvious. He could only bring them with him, rush through the door, cross the space-time tunnel, and directly enter the other world. With this thought in mind, Luo Fan slowly sat cross-legged in the air and began to adjust his aura according to what was shown on the mirror. The change in aura was so complicated that even if Luo Fan was confident that he could do it, he still needed to practice a step ahead in order to ensure that he wouldn't make any mistakes due to a moment of negligence during the execution, which would cause the final result to be in vain. In the process of making contact, his aura began to change slightly. At one moment, it became tall and lofty, and at another, it became wretched and disgusting, and at another, it became oppressively noble, and at another, it became extremely dignified, and at another, it made people feel like they were bathing in a spring breeze, and at another, it made people feel like they were falling into an abyss. The various changes flashed faster and faster, and the changes became more and more subtle. In the end, after a few days, the speed at which Luo Fan's aura changed completely surpassed the senses of living beings, causing Luo Fan to float in the air as if he did not have any aura. There was only a slightly blurry feeling around his body, which made people know that he was definitely not ordinary. Definitely not ordinary. Luo Fan slowly opened his eyes and sensed the changes in his aura. After comparing it with what was shown on the mirror, he nodded in satisfaction. I'm finally done. If that's the case, it should be no problem for me to enter the door. This thought flashed through his mind. After this thought flashed through his mind, he looked at the vortex in front of him and a huge door in the middle of the vortex. Suddenly, he had a feeling that he was a part of the vortex, a part of the door. He even vaguely felt that his spirit had already connected with the door and the vortex. It was as if his thoughts and his spirit could guide the changes in the vortex and change the opening and closing of the door. I see. Luo Fan let out a long sigh and casually moved his hand. The door that was originally tightly shut, to the point where even the stars looked like sand beneath it, slowly trembled. A small gap began to slowly appear between the two doors, and an incomparably dense aura of the devil realm rushed out from it. The demonic aura was so dense that it had even taken a physical form. It constantly twisted and changed in the void, forming all sorts of strange scenes. It formed a variety of strange scenes. They seemed to be strange beasts and living beings, formidable cultivators, and even strange mountains and precipitous cliffs. All sorts of strange scenes were mixed together to form a scene that caused one to exclaim in admiration. So changing one's aura isn't just about fusing with it. I can also control it. Luo Fan sighed. This was something he hadn't thought of before. Although there were many descriptions on the runes, the description of the effect was quite simple, making it difficult for Luo Fan to deduce too many results. He only knew that after changing one's aura, the door would treat it as a part of him, allowing him to easily pass through it. However, he didn't know that after changing one's aura, one would become a part of the door. Naturally, one could also use one's will to influence the door and control it slightly. After all, the door was so grand and vast, but it was made of an ignorant material. No matter how high its essence was, it wouldn't be able to resist the control of a part of his will. After Luo Fan's aura changed, it naturally became a part of the door. Naturally, his will became a part of the door, and naturally, he was able to control the door a little. Although this accident was beyond Luo Fan's expectations, it was clearly a good thing. After a slight sigh, a smile appeared on his face. With a light step, his figure had already arrived in front of the door. He stood in front of the door. He was facing the crack. The huge vortex that was blocking him like a natural moat did not change in the slightest during this process. It was as if Luo Fan's appearance was due to the operation of the vortex itself. There was no change that was different from the normal operation of the vortex because of his appearance. The huge door was located in the center of the whirlpool. The power that formed the whirlpool here was much denser and denser than in other places. It condensed into a continent-like existence below the door. Boundless and endless, Luo Fan stood there, facing this door, as if he was standing on a vast piece of land, facing an indomitable wall of the sky. If he was an ordinary person, he would probably be shocked by such a grand and vast will. Of course, Luo Fan was not an ordinary person. His senses enveloped the entire universe at all times. It was so vast and grand. In contrast, the door and the whirlpool were far inferior in this aspect. How could they bring him any shock? Although the crack he made on the huge door was very small, it was only for the huge door. In terms of absolute power, the crack itself was still quite huge and shocking. However, it was not a problem for it to accommodate a mountain. Luo Fan stood in front of the door, facing such a crack. The extremely rich aura of the devil domain assaulted his senses. The endless and unpredictable lights and shadows directly wrapped around him, surging around him endlessly and changing irregularly, making him feel as if he had become a part of these countless, unpredictable lights and shadows. This is definitely not the density of the aura that a normal world should have. Luo Fan raised his hand and grabbed a strand of aura. He felt the soft and tough feeling like cow tendons, and such a thought flashed through his mind. Cultivators might be able to survive and obtain considerable benefits in such a dense aura, but ordinary creatures would definitely not be able to grow and reproduce safely under such a dense aura. Even if the demon realm was an incredible world, and even if there were unimaginably powerful demon realm sages, it was impossible for all cultivators to exist there. There must be ordinary creatures living there. In this case, it could be confirmed that such a dense demon realm aura could not be the true density of the demon realm. It could only be the density of the aura that was condensed under the effect of some mechanism. Only in this way could the density of the aura be so dense that it could even turn into a substance and transform into countless light and shadow that belong to the demon realm. That's right. When Luo Fan first saw the countless scenes condensed by this aura, he knew that the many scenes in front of him were none other than the things that had happened or were happening in the demon realm, had existed, or were existing. Where did the aura of a world come from? This point was very mysterious. Different cultivators and different civilizations would have completely different expressions. However, fundamentally speaking, the aura of a world was the overall performance of the aura of everything in the world. In other words, the aura of the Earth universe was the performance of the aura of everything in the Earth universe combined into a whole. The aura of the primordial world was also the product of the combination of everything in the primordial world. Chapter 1190. Luo Fan stood there, looking at the many unpredictable scenes around him, and his expression became incomparably calm. Through the gap, he could see that the thickness of the huge door was unimaginably huge. At first glance, it seemed that it would not be a problem for it to accommodate thousands of stars side by side. Looking at the tiny gap in the door, it seemed like a bottomless abyss. If it were not for Luo Fan's amazing eyesight, he would not have been able to see through the gap to the end of the door. After passing through the end, there were all kinds of lights changing unpredictably, like a world formed by sprinkling watercolors. There was nothing meaningful there at all. The endless aura that belonged to the demon world gushed out from the colorful world. After the aura gushed out, due to the terrifying pressure produced by the vortex, it naturally condensed around the door. More accurately, it condensed in front of the gap and filled the huge continent formed by an inexplicable power in the center of the vortex. At first, because the aura was too dense, it naturally evolved into all kinds of strange and unpredictable forms. Almost every instant, there would be billions of different scenes revolving around the crack of the door, constantly swallowing and spitting, constantly changing. However, as time passed, the aura gradually dispersed and gradually filled the eye of the huge vortex. It unknowingly thinned out, and the various scenes that condensed naturally disappeared, turning into fog. Then, as more and more aura gushed out, the fog became denser and denser, gradually evolving into various scenes. However, these scenes were different from the previous ones. They did not change as quickly as they had at the beginning. Instead, they gradually stabilized, causing the originally desolate land around the door to gradually change. In the end, after a few days, the land had turned into an indescribable world. This world seemed to be full of vitality, no longer desolate like before. Mountains and rivers, plains and hills, forests and grasslands, towns and villages, immortal mountains and blessed lands, all kinds of natural sceneries appeared on this continent in an extremely dense manner, illuminating this huge portal as if it had appeared in a boundless world. It seemed to exist in the center of a boundless world. If that was all, it could only be said to be a world. It cannot be called strange. The reason why this world was called strange was that the entire world was developing from scratch at an unimaginable speed. It was as if time had sped up hundreds of millions of times on this land. In an instant, this world seemed to have developed by several trillion times. In an instant, in just a few blinks of an eye, the world had changed. From the birth of a living being, to its growth, to its eventual death, it did not even take an instant. Such a change could not even be described with the word strange. It was inconceivable. This is the demon world? Luo Fan looked at this strange world and could not help but show a surprised expression on his face. The effect of this world on the world was the natural evolution of the various auras contained in the various auras. The vortex's effect was similar to that of a prism's mirror to sunlight. It could separate the various auras that were originally mixed together and recombine them according to the original way, thus evolving into this extremely strange world. As for why this world developed at such a fast speed, it contained many mysteries, but for Luo Fan at this moment, he still could not be sure. He could only roughly guess that the secret was probably related to the reason why the aura of the demon world was so rich. No, this is not the true appearance of the demon world. This is just a scene formed by the interaction of auras. It's the same reason as the rune showing the appearance of a mirror. It may contain many characteristics of the true appearance, but it is unlikely to be the true appearance. Luo Fan's heart moved, and he instantly overturned his previous guess. The scene in the world of auras in front of him was formed by the interaction of auras. It was the auras of the many substances in the demon world. Formed by the interaction, their composition was only based on the aura, but not their original appearance. It was more likely that the appearance of this world was the true appearance of the demon world after being distorted and changed. If Luo Fan knew the rules of this kind of change, he could even reflect it one by one, and thus deduce the true appearance of the demon world. However, he obviously did not know that kind of rule at this time. Moreover, there was not much meaning to this kind of deduction. This world already contained many secrets of the demon realm. Under such circumstances, what was the true appearance of the demon realm? Obviously, it was just a facade. For him, apart from satisfying himself when he pursued perfection, what else was there to it? Luo Fan's thoughts moved, and his perception swept across the entire continent in an instant. He saw everything that was happening on this continent, including everything that was happening in this world, and he sensed it with his mind. This was an extremely complete and extremely grand world. Although it was only formed by auras, in this world, Luo Fan found dozens of areas that he could not detect. From afar, those areas seemed to possess an inconceivable pressure. They seemed to contain all the mysteries of the universe, and vaguely possessed the charm of being indestructible, omniscient, and omniscient. Around these areas, there were tens of thousands of places that shook his mind, making him feel that it was extremely difficult to detect, and he was faced with extremely strong resistance. It seemed that if he wanted to break through them, he would trigger a shocking counterattack. Those dozens of places must be related to the sages. It is very likely that they are formed by the aura of the sages. In an instant, Luo Fan made a judgment. In the aura of the demon world, it contained the secrets of everything in the demon world, including the sages of the demon world. Therefore, in the aura of the demon world, under normal circumstances, should contain the aura of the sages. According to this deduction, it was very obvious that if the aura of the demon world was divided and returned to its original appearance, then the aura of the sages of the demon world would be captured again. It occupied an extremely important part of this world of auras. If this logic was correct, then the tens of thousands of areas that made Luo Fan feel that there was an extremely strong counterattack power in them were obviously transformed from the auras of those practitioners who had higher cultivation realms than Luo Fan and were even much stronger than him. If this is really the case, then there are a total of 54 sages in the demon world. More than 300,000 beings who have stepped on the 9 steps below the sages? How is this possible? Luo Fan frowned. An expression of disbelief appeared on his face. Every level of the world had a limit on the endurance of the practitioner's cultivation realms. The spirit space, the medium world, and the boundless world were the 3 levels of the world that could withstand the number of practitioners. In the perfect world of the untainted land and the earth universe, as long as one had not become a sage, then, no matter how many practitioners there were, it could easily accommodate them. However, once a practitioner's cultivation realm broke through the immortal realm and reached the sage realm, then it would cause a huge impact on such a perfect world, so that the world could only accommodate a limited number of sages to cultivate there. Once the number of sages exceeded the limit to cultivate in the perfect world, it would cause irreparable damage to the perfect world. Then the perfect world would gradually collapse and be gradually destroyed. And this number, generally speaking, was in the single digits. If one wanted to completely surpass such a limit and make a world able to accommodate countless sages to cultivate in, then the world would have to go through 9 great tribulations of heaven and earth, become a great world, and raise its level by 1 level. For example, the Tianyuan Great World, where Luo Fan had a doppelganger, and the Jili Great World, where practitioners had crossed the vast chaos to arrive, were all such great worlds. If it was really a great world, such as the Tianyuan Great World, where there were even 800 sages, Luo Fan would only feel shocked, but would not think that it was impossible, because for a great world, this was very normal. However, in the demon realm, Luo Fan would never have such a feeling. The demon realm was mysterious. No matter how many secrets it had and how deep the secrets it contained, it was, after all, only a part of a perfect world like the Earth universe. Even the Earth universe could only have 7 sages. How could there be as many as 54 sages in the demon realm? With so many sages, any one of their actions could cause the entire demon realm to collapse. Even their auras had already caused an extremely huge pressure on the entire demon realm, causing the entire demon realm to be overwhelmed. In fact, it might even completely collapse in a short period of time. Impossible, these can't all be sages. Perhaps this is something related to sages, such as a sage's dojo or something like that. Luo Fan chose to believe in himself in the end. As for why the sages of the demon realm had opened so many dojos and why they had placed so many things that belonged to them everywhere in the demon realm, this was not something that he could consider now. If that's the case, then the auras of these 300,000 plus cultivators that have stepped onto the steps might not all be from the cultivators that have stepped onto the steps, but instead, they might be related to them and contain their auras. Following this reasoning, Luo Fan came to such a conclusion. However, although he had already come to this conclusion, he still had some doubts in his heart. According to common sense, although it was as he had thought before, common sense was common sense after all. The current reality was that the auras were right there. There were 54 sages' auras, which meant that there were more than 300,000 cultivators who had stepped onto steps. How could he dare to make a conclusion before he could fully confirm it? With a slight thought, Luo Fan lifted his foot and took a light step forward. In the blink of an eye, he had already arrived at the place where the 54 sages' auras were shrouded. It was a mountain peak that looked rather short and was only tens of thousands of meters high. This mountain peak was surrounded by mountains that were millions or even tens of millions of meters tall. Of course, it was considered extremely short. Unlike the surrounding places where the flow of time seemed to be extremely fast, the flow of time on this mountain peak seemed to be completely normal. In other words, it was completely the same as the flow of time on Luo Fan's side. On the edge of this mountain peak, an instant outside was an unknown number of trillions of seconds, and behind this line, an instant was an instant. The flowers and trees outside had changed for countless generations, and even the sea had changed into mulberry fields countless times. After the line, the fallen leaves had not even fallen to the ground. This mysterious and strange scene caused Luo Fan's eyes to gradually emit an inexplicable light. His mind moved slightly, the flow of time where he was changed accordingly. It might not be easy for other cultivators to control the flow of time. But for Luo Fan, who had begun to study the way of time since he achieved the earthly immortal Tao fruit, it was extremely simple. With just a slight thought, the flow of time on his body began to slowly accelerate. 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times, 10,000 times. In the blink of an eye, he accelerated the flow of time on his body to more than 100,000 times the normal speed. In other words, his 100,000 years. For the outside world, only a year had passed. His 100,000 moments were only equivalent to a single moment in the outside world. To change the flow of time on his body to such an extent, this was the first time for him. When he accelerated the flow of time to such an extent, he felt that the mana in his body was like a dam that had collapsed. It began to pour out crazily. It was constantly being consumed to maintain the flow of time on his body and to resist the invasion of time from the outside world. If he could not generate power on his own and did not need to absorb power from the outside world to replenish his consumption, even if his mana was tens of thousands of times more than it was now, he would not be able to support the outside world for a few breaths. But at this time, the power in his body was rapidly generated, and it constantly replenished the mana that he had consumed. Although he felt a little pressured, he could maintain this state for a long time. So that's how it is. Luo Fan looked at the mountain peak in front of him, and his expression was somewhat shocked. He sped up the flow of time on his body, of course, not to show how profound and powerful his attainments in the way of time were. He did this to study the mysteries of the mountain peak that seemed to be formed from the aura of a sage. As he sped up the flow of time on his body, he found that the mountain peak in front of him did not seem to have changed at all. No matter how many times he sped up the flow of time, whether it was 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, or 100 times, 1,000 times, 10,000 times, or even 100,000 times, the scene on the mountain peak in front of him looked exactly the same. The original way the leaves should have fallen, the plants should have swayed, and the airflow should have flowed were all the same. There was not a single trace of abnormality. It was as if he had not sped up the flow of time on his body at all. Such a change was truly strange and indescribable. It was incomparably mysterious. Luo Fan slowly changed the flow of time on his body, sometimes speeding it up and sometimes slowing it down. And no matter how he changed it, he found that the mountain peak in front of him did not change at all. Instead, the light and shadow around his body kept changing, sometimes speeding it up and sometimes slowing it down, corresponding to the changes in the flow of time on his body. Why is this happening? This seems to be the same as the results of the secular world's research on the speed of light. Luo Fan frowned as he slowly recovered the changes in the flow of time on his body. Soon, the flow of time on his body returned to normal. The secular world regarded the speed of light as the fastest speed in the universe. Of course, this was just a joke to Luo Fan at this moment. When he flew, it was easy for him to surpass the speed of light. And there was another result of the secular world's research on the speed of light. That was, the speed of light was absolute. No matter what frame of reference, the speed of light would not change. It was always 300,000 kilometers per second. In other words, no matter which direction you move at what speed, even if it's tens of thousands of kilometers per second, the speed of the light relative to you is the same. It's still 300,000 kilometers per second. At this moment, the mountain peak in front of Luo Fan had the same effect. No matter how much Luo Fan changed the flow of time on his body, the flow of time on the mountain peak in front of him was fixed and unchanging. Thinking about the secular world's research on the speed of light, Luo Fan suddenly had an ominous premonition. With a slight thought, he took a light step forward, urging his body to move forward by 1,000 feet. This was already within the range of the mountain peak. However, when he stopped, he found that he had not entered the range of the mountain peak at all. His body was quietly standing a line away from the mountain peak. The tip of his feet just happened to touch that line. As expected, looking at where he was, Luo Fan could not help but sigh. He could feel that the technique he had just used was completely effective. In other words, all of his senses, including the consumption of energy, showed that he had already crossed a distance of 300 meters. However, in reality, he was stuck in the gap between the mountain peak and the outside. It was impossible for him to step into the range of the mountain peak. Chapter 1191. This situation was within Luo Fan's expectations. Through changing the flow of time in his body, Luo Fan had already found out that the flow of time within the range of this mountain peak formed from the aura of a saint was absolute. Regardless of the observer's own flow of time, the flow of time in this mountain peak was the same. This was the same as the speed of light measured by the observer's speed. Evidently, the speed of light was an absolute speed in the universe that mortals could only approach but could not reach. Therefore, according to the same logic, if the flow of time in this mountain peak was absolute to Luo Fan, it would be the same as the speed of light to mortals. It was an absolute existence that could only be approached but could not be reached. To break through this limit and allow Luo Fan to break through the barrier and enter the range of the mountain peak was like a mortal breaking through the limit of the speed of light. The only way was to improve one's life essence, turning from a mortal into a powerful cultivator. For example, Luo Fan could break through the limit of the speed of light with just a thought. Similarly, if Luo Fan wanted to break through this absolute limit and enter the range of the mountain peak that was just a line away, what he needed to do was to continuously improve his cultivation realm until he reached an unbelievable level. He needed to reach a height where he could understand these changes and break through the limit. That way, he would be able to easily step into the range of the mountain peak. This mountain peak was formed from the aura of a saint. If Luo Fan wanted to reach a height where he could ignore the limit, he would need to at least be close to the saint realm and the origin fruit of Tao. He might even need to attain the origin fruit of Tao and become a supreme saint to achieve this. Luo Fan stood a line away from the mountain peak with an unwilling expression on his face. The mountain peak in front of him was formed from the aura of a saint. If he could enter it, it would be equivalent to entering the interior of the aura of a saint. He would be able to sense the mysteries of the aura at all times, even if he could not completely sense it. However, he would definitely gain a lot from it. It was impossible to directly become a saint, but it was definitely not difficult to raise one's cultivation level by a level. Under this unwillingness, his mind moved slightly. He lifted his foot again and took a light step forward. This step, he unleashed his teleportation divine art to the limit. If it was somewhere else, this step of his was enough to cross more than half of the universe, a distance of who knew how many billions of light years. In an instant, light and shadow swirled around him, and in a trance, he felt as if he had really crossed such a great distance. Be it the changes in his body or the changes in his power, they all told him that he was now hundreds of millions of light years away from where he was originally, or even trillions of light years away. However, when the changes in the surrounding light and shadow subsided, his position was exactly the same as before he took that step. Even his footsteps were the same as before, and they still brushed against the edge of the mountain. All of a sudden, his heart trembled. Without using any divine abilities or techniques, he took a step forward and walked toward the mountain peak like an ordinary person. In the end, there was no surprise. His movements did not change at all, and his body was no different from a normal person walking. It seemed that the distance he took was no different from a normal person. However, under such a completely normal situation, when his foot landed, the position where his front foot landed was still in front of the boundary, and it still brushed against the boundary. Compared to before, there was not even the slightest bit of progress. This inexplicable situation made Luo Fan unable to help but smile bitterly. In the end, it still won't work. My cultivation level is a little bit lower, and it's a completely different world. He sighed and finally gave up on the idea of stepping into the range of the mountain peak in front of him. Luo Fan raised his head and looked at the mountain peak in front of him carefully comprehending the mysteries of the mountain range. He wanted to use this method to indirectly comprehend a trace of the mysteries of the Devil Realm sages. It was a pity that the mountain peak in front of them was completely ordinary. It looked like an ordinary mountain peak that existed on an ordinary planet. There was nothing extraordinary about it all. Looking at it, it was like looking at an ordinary mountain peak. What one wanted to comprehend was the mysteries of heaven and earth. How could one comprehend the mysteries of a sage? Luo Fan sat quietly for a few months, but in the end, he gained nothing. If he had to say that he had gained something, it was only the mysteries of heaven and earth that he knew before. As for the mysteries of the sages, there was nothing at all. With a slight sigh, Luo Fan finally decided not to stay here. With a light step, he walked through 54 places that were suspected to be formed by the aura of the sages in a row. Some of these places were lakes, some were rivers, some were valleys, some were seas, and some were strange villas shrouded in fog. There were all kinds of strange things. However, every single one of these 54 locations had the same characteristic. That was the flow of time in each of them was absolute. No matter how Luo Fan changed the flow of time, he could not see the change in the flow of time. And it was the same as the first place he reached. No matter what method he used, no matter how far he stepped, and no matter what movement he used to break through, he could not step into those areas. He was blocked outside by the boundaries of those areas, and he could not get close at all. And every place was the same as before. No matter how he observed from the outside, he could not gain anything, and he could not obtain any mysteries that belonged to the sages. Standing in front of the last area that looked like nothingness, Luo Fan let out a long sigh. I originally thought that it was a great opportunity, but I did not expect to see it, but not be able to touch it. At this moment, he had already discovered the most obvious difference between the sages of the demon realm and those of the earth universe. The sages of the demon realm seemed to have completely hidden all of their mysteries, so that any cultivator, as long as their cultivation realm did not reach a certain level, they would definitely not be able to comprehend even a little bit. But the sages of the earth universe were not like this. They displayed their mysteries without any scruples. The shadows that they left behind, the voices that they left behind, the imprints that they left behind, the magical powers that they left behind, the magic treasures that they left behind, everything was placed there. It was up to you to comprehend. It was up to you to study. How much you could obtain and how many benefits you could obtain from it, it all depended on your own luck. Which of these two different ways of doing things was more profound? Which was more unpredictable? It was naturally impossible for Luo Fan to know. But it was very obvious that he preferred the style of the sages of the earth universe. After secretly criticizing for a while, a faint smile appeared on his face. Although it is hidden so deeply, but it is not that there is no way to comprehend it indirectly. Such a thought flashed in his mind. His eyes turned to the boundary line between the real and the nothingness under his feet. How long has it been since I walked the way of an ordinary person? He thought to himself. He lifted his feet and walked forward in the way of an ordinary person. That's right, this was the method that he thought of to comprehend the mysteries of the sages from the side. To comprehend the mysteries of the sages, the other methods that Luo Fan had used before were all useless. They were unable to trigger any changes in the areas in front of him. But in the process of him walking forward like an ordinary person and entering that area, something extremely abnormal and unbelievable happened. That was everything that he stepped out seemed so normal, but the final landing point was as if he was walking on the spot. The source of this abnormality was obviously the area in front of him that was suspected to be formed by the aura of the sages. Therefore, for Luo Fan, as long as he could discover the source of this abnormality and understand the principles behind it, he would naturally be able to understand some of the mysteries of the sages. Perhaps it would not be much, but it would be valuable enough to bring him enough benefits. This process was obviously an extremely long and difficult process. He walked forward step by step. Each step was very normal, but the final landing point was extremely mysterious. From the outside, it seemed that he was also continuously walking forward, but the final result was still the same as before. It gave people the feeling that time and space had become completely chaotic. Luo Fan tightly closed his eyes as he walked, carefully sensing the subtle changes that were caused by his every step. The mysterious mechanism that caused his progress to become abnormal was extremely mysterious, profound, and obscure. In the first 10 years, he had gained nothing at all, no matter how he tried to comprehend it. He could not find any trace of abnormality. It was as if he had walked for more than 10 years and walked millions of miles like a normal person. However, after all, Luo Fan was already a town master at the exceptional realm. His cultivation and his sensing ability had reached an unimaginable peak. This abnormality happened for more than 10 years and happened to him hundreds of millions of times. No matter how mysterious, profound, and obscure it was, he gradually grasped a trace of it. Finally, after walking like this for 100 years, Luo Fan completely entered the state of no one and no me. All his mind, and all his attention were focused on the traces of the abnormal mechanism that he had grasped. In this state, he faintly felt that there was a huge river coming toward him in front of him. Flowing in this river was an extremely mysterious liquid substance. That liquid substance seemed to be the mysteries of the great Tao, yet it also seemed to be some kind of supreme principle. It was more like some kind of origin mechanism of the universe. Every time he took a step forward, the oncoming river would instantly wash him into silence. Even he himself did not feel that he had taken a step back and returned to his original position. For every 10 steps he took forward, the river would wash him back 10 steps. In this way, no matter how fast he moved, no matter how strong his strength was, the force of the river would be opposite to him. No matter how hard he tried, he would be washed back in an instant and return to his original position. Facing this river that flowed with the mysteries of the Great Way, the supreme truth, and the origin mechanism of the universe, Luo Fan was like a fish in water. He poured all his attention and spirit into the river that flowed endlessly in front of him. He constantly comprehended the many mysteries contained in the river and absorbed them. It turned into a pushing force that pushed his cultivation level forward. It was extremely difficult, but it firmly pushed his cultivation level up bit by bit. In this state, he had completely lost all sense of time in the outside world. 1,000 years passed in the blink of an eye. On this day, an uninvited guest appeared in the void layer at the center of the entire universe. This person had the appearance of an old man. He wore a wizard's robe and had an ethereal aura about him. There was even a hint of a deeply hidden, decaying aura. This person was none other than the divine. He was divine. Currently, it was still a distance away from the door that Luo Fan had promised to bring him with him. It had already been more than 1,000 years since he entered the other universe. This period of time was naturally nothing to Divine, who had lived for tens of billions of years. In the past, he would not even have the thought of remembering it. But at this moment, the opportunity to enter the other universe was right in front of him. He had even made arrangements for his funeral. In a situation where he had made preparations to pass on everything he had, these 1,000 years of time naturally seemed especially long. At this moment, he did not hear anything for a long time. He had trained that god and taught him everything he could. All that was left was for him to unravel the final mystery after he left. Finally, he could not resist the pressure of the countless layers of the abyss above him and the countless demons who had ill intentions towards him. He came to the endless abyss where the huge whirlpool was located to see what Luo Fan had done. How could this be? Could he have already left? As soon as he arrived, Divine could not help but be shocked. He was now at the place where he and Luo Fan had first appeared, at the edge of the huge whirlpool, facing the huge door. After 1,000 years of cultivation, Divine's cultivation had become much stronger than before, and he was now a primordial pure yang expert. Although this cultivation level was like that of an ant to Luo Fan, it was enough for him to have unimaginable eyesight. It was enough for him to instantly discover the difference between this door and how it was 1,000 years ago. Compared to the door, the crack of the door, which was extremely small but large enough to allow a mountain to pass through, was directly imprinted in his eyes. Back then, when he left Luo Fan here and left for the world of the crystal wall to reminisce about his tens of billions of years of life, he had left Luo Fan here to find a way to open the huge door. But now, that portal had opened to such a huge gap. Even if thousands of people were to pass through it together, it wouldn't take them half a day to do so. How could he not suspect that Luo Fan had already left him behind and directly passed through the portal? No, absolutely not. The immortal doesn't need to lie to me. That would not benefit him at all. It would not take much effort to bring me along. The immortal would definitely not leave by himself. Divine was, after all, not an ordinary person. In this moment of shock, he was still able to regain his senses and directly overturn his previous guess. After slightly relaxing, he then noticed that the surroundings of the door were different from that of Lake Dang. The door was so huge that even the stars seemed to have become sand compared to it. Although the area around the door was as large as a boundless continent, and even the terrain of the continent was undulating and the difference in height was huge, compared to the door that surrounded it, it seemed so small, like an ant under the feet of an ordinary person. Under such circumstances, it was extremely normal that Divine did not immediately notice the abnormality there. Could the immortal be in that new world? Seeing the new world that had appeared at the edge of the door, Divine could not help but speculate. At this moment, the best thing to do was, of course, to cross the vortex and directly enter the center of the vortex, in front of the door and search that continent. However, it was obvious that when Luo Fan had wanted to cross this vortex, he had needed to expend a lot of effort to fill in the runes to 99% before he could find a completely safe way to cross it. Compared to Luo Fan, Divine was just an ant, so how could he do that? To him, this huge vortex was a natural moat, and he simply could not find any way to cross it to the door. Otherwise, why would he have only sent Luo Fan to the edge of the vortex and not directly to the door? Therefore, although he had already guessed what Luo Fan was doing in that new world, he could only watch from afar. However, he could only watch from afar. He simply could not determine whether Luo Fan was in that world or not. At the moment, Luo Fan was outside one of the 54 places that he suspected to be formed by the aura of a saint. However, it was impossible for all of the 54 places to be in front of the door. They repelled each other, but were evenly distributed to various parts of this continent. Luo Fan was currently in an area behind the door. If one looked from the front, they would only be able to see the front of the door, but not Luo Fan. Holiness quickly understood this point. Chapter 1192. This whirlpool was just too huge. Although Saint had already achieved primordial unity pure yang, he was still extremely tiny compared to this whirlpool. His strength was really not enough compared to this huge whirlpool. Therefore, the time it took him to go around this whirlpool was more than 10 years. Moreover, even so, he had used the fastest speed he could sustain to see the scene on the continent in the center of the whirlpool. If he had flown leisurely like he usually did, it would have taken him at least 10 times or even dozens of times longer to complete the same process. Flying non-stop for 10 years was an extremely rare experience for a divine. Usually, he could reach wherever he wanted to go with just a thought. Even if he was far away, he could easily cross over using the technological means of the supreme divine land. Flying non-stop for 10 years was something that had never happened before. But under such circumstances, flying for 10 years had brought him a very obvious consequence. There was a weariness on his face. This weariness did not come from his body. Compared to Luo Fan, he was just an ant. After all, he was a primordial unity pure yang expert. Under normal circumstances, it was not impossible for him to destroy the world. How could he possibly feel tired just because of 10 years of flying? This weariness came from the weariness of his mind. Because he could not find his target, could not see the end, and had to constantly focus on the many details on the continent that was extremely far away, his mind, which had already become very irritated due to his tens of billions of years of life, was now feeling a weariness that he had never felt before. This weariness was so obvious. It caused the aura of decay that had been deeply hidden in his body to emerge again without him realizing it. This aura of decay was brought about by his deepest obsession over the past tens of billions of years. Even the cultivation method that Luo Fan had taught him could not eliminate it. At this moment, it was stimulated a little, so it naturally reappeared. However, no matter how big the whirlpool was, it would eventually have an end. After 10 years, Saint finally returned to the starting point where he had started circling. How could it not be? Saint was suddenly filled with indescribable despair when he arrived. The aura of decay became even more intense. His tired expression became more and more obvious. He circled around, but did not see Luo Fan at all. No matter which region of the continent it was the same. This was not a contradiction. Although Holiness only circled the whirlpool from afar, the direction he could see was also limited. However, it didn't mean that he couldn't see every region on that continent. It was like a cylinder with many obstacles. Most people would need to carefully change the angle to bypass any obstacle. They could see anywhere they wanted, including the walls of the tube. That was why for the divine, even if they were blocked by the terrain or mountains, they only needed to change their position and look from another angle to bypass the obstacles and see the region. Of course, this required a combination of meticulous calculation and observational skills to be absolutely certain of this, and it was clear that the divine did not lack either of these. That was why he could be so certain that the places he saw were all over the continent, and that he didn't see Luo Fan, which meant that Luo Fan really wasn't on that continent. Impossible. Impossible. There's no need for you to lie to me, immortal elder, and there's no need for you to go back on your word. Saint forcibly suppressed his fluctuating emotions and comforted himself in his mind. The appearance of this thought made his state of mind slightly calm down. However, he still felt despair and irritation. He had lived in this universe for tens of billions of years and was already sick of it. If hope were to disappear in front of him, he didn't dare to imagine what would happen to him, how long he could live, and whether he would be killed by the eternal pressure. He carefully recalled everything he had seen in the past 10 years. After all, he was already a primordial unity, pure yang cultivator. As he recalled, an increasingly complete continent gradually appeared in his mind. It took him a full 10 years to go around and observe this continent, but when he rebuilt the model of this continent and simulated it in his mind, it only took him a short 4 hours. After 4 hours, the complete circular continent and the unimaginably tall portal appeared in his mind. Of course, the various scenes on this continent were clearly just a portion of what he understood. Moreover, there was not even a single bit of profoundness contained within them. They were all just superficial things. He could only see the surface of the 54 strange spots that were suspected to be formed by the aura of the sages, the over 300,000 cultivators that were suspected to be formed by the aura of the sage-to-be, and the more numerous areas that were formed by the sage-to-be cultivators. He couldn't see the abnormalities inside at all. If the 54 areas that were suspected to be formed by the aura of the sages were regarded as light, then Luo Fan would be a scientist who had studied light in depth and knew the absolute speed of light, that it was the ultimate speed and the effect of the speed of light on time. On the other hand, Holiness was like an ignorant baby who had just opened his eyes and didn't even know that what he saw was light. This difference made it so that even though the holy saint had built up the appearance of this continent in his mind, he had gained very little. It could even be said that he had gained nothing. Where is this? Immortal Senior should be on this continent. Now that the portal is open, Immortal Senior can't possibly leave this place to do anything. Holiness thought to himself as he carefully observed the model of the continent that appeared in his mind. Bit by bit, he recalled everything that he had seen back then. He kept checking the places that he couldn't possibly have missed. After a few days, Holiness suddenly shuddered. This continent is definitely not simple. Not only did I miss some things, but everything I saw was wrong. At this moment, his face was full of shock, and his eyes were mixed with an indescribable excitement and expectation. The aura of decay that was so thick that it could be compared to when he had not started cultivating, and the despair that was born from the bottom of his heart, all disappeared without a trace at this moment. After thinking for a few days, he finally discovered the most obvious abnormality on this continent that he had previously overlooked. That was the scenes that he had put together. On the timeline, it was not the same timeline at all. For example, there was a mountain where the time between this side and the other side was at least tens of millions of years. And there was another lake. One corner of the lake was billions of years slower than the other timelines. How could this be? Holiness was shocked. His thirst for knowledge was unprecedentedly high. He didn't know what was going on, but if Luo Fan knew what he was doing, he would understand that this oversight was very simple. It couldn't be any simpler. As a primordial unity pure yang cultivator, even if Holiness had the terrifying power to destroy the entire universe, he was still looking at the continent from the perspective of a primordial unity pure yang cultivator. What he saw was also what a primordial unity pure yang cultivator would see. It should be known that there were 54 areas on this continent that were suspected to be formed by the aura of sages. There were more than 300,000 areas that were suspected to be formed by the aura of the cultivators who had stepped on the steps. For Luo Fan, he couldn't even step into those 54 areas that were suspected to be formed by the aura of sages. He couldn't even see the areas where the 300,000 cultivators had stepped on the steps clearly. He felt that there was a profound mystery in them, so he couldn't distinguish them for a while. If that was the case for Luo Fan, how could it be for Holiness? Under the limitations of his cultivation realm, he turned a blind eye to the vast majority of the mysteries of the continent's evolution that was unimaginably fast, just like how Luo Fan felt towards the region of the saint's aura. It was obviously extremely abnormal for him to return to the same place after walking forward a fine line. However, his first impression was that it was a matter of course. It was as if he had to stay in the same place after taking that step. That was why he didn't notice the unimaginable speed of development of the continent that was mostly formed by the aura of cultivators whose cultivation realm was higher than his. Even if he did see it, he felt that it was only natural. It wasn't until now, when he used his mind to observe the continent and comprehend the mysteries within that continent, that he realized something was wrong and that there were deeper mysteries hidden within it. So that's how it is. If the continent's timeline is developing millions of times faster than the timeline I'm in, then it makes sense. Holiness gradually calmed down and began to think about the reasons for the many abnormalities. His memory was astounding, allowing him to remember where he was standing in the regions that formed the locations of many things, as well as the time difference between different angles and different locations. Through such time differences, he could roughly deduce how much faster the continent's timeline was compared to his own. If that's the case, then the continent I see should look like this. Holiness thought to himself. Within his mind, that single continent began to have countless overlapping images. They gradually split apart, and in the end, there was no telling how many broken continents there were. Those were the continents he had seen in the various timelines. Immortal Elder, he should be in one of these continents that has yet to be mended. He looked at the countless broken continents, a mixture of sadness and joy appearing on his face. Because they were in different timelines, these broken continents could be said to be parallel. Unless Holiness could instantly see all the locations of the continents in the same timeline, he would not be able to completely grasp the traces of a living being on the continent. However, if there was even a tiny bit missing, he would not be able to do this. This wasn't hard to understand. In a certain timeline, it was not hard to understand. On a certain timeline, even if Holiness could see most of the area, as long as a small part was missing, Luo Fan might still be in that small part, just outside of his range of observation. In the next instant, even if he could see that small part again, it would be something from another timeline. Perhaps Luo Fan had already left that location in that timeline, so he naturally would not be able to see him. This was the difference between different timelines. Holiness, who had lived for tens of billions of years, was naturally very clear on this point. Therefore, just now, he had reconstructed an unknown number of continents in his mind. These continents, they were continents in different timelines. To determine Luo Fan's location, he needed to add up the area of all the continents in different timelines to be able to determine Luo Fan's location in these timelines. Adding up the area would be as vast as the area of countless continents. At this moment, Holiness, what he had obtained, but it was only the scenery of one region of this continent. Counting all, he could not even completely determine Luo Fan's location in an innumerable region. How could he possibly discover Luo Fan's location just like that? Thinking this through clearly, Holiness's heart finally calmed down. On the contrary, hope surged in his heart. The thirst for knowledge in his eyes finally suppressed the absolute aura of decay that existed on his body for the first time, causing his body to carry an aura of thirst for knowledge, causing people to gradually overlook the deeply hidden decay. It's impossible for me to clearly see the entire continent at a glance. No matter how I go in circles, how I observe, I can only obtain a small part of the scene in each of the countless timelines. Unless my luck is heaven-defying, it's impossible for me to find a mortal master's location. Holiness already knew that with his ability, it was impossible for him to discover Luo Fan's location. With that thought in mind, the corners of his mouth gradually curled up into a faint smile. Of course, it was impossible for him to confirm that the person he was looking for was not there after searching for an innumerable portion. Therefore, the result of logical reasoning was clearly the more correct one. Therefore, at this moment, Holiness no longer doubted that Luo Fan was on that continent. After completely relaxing, he began to treat the strange continent in front of him as his research object. His eyes were fixed on the continent in front of him, comparing it with the countless continents that he saw in his mind and consciousness. Through this comparison, he slowly searched for the mysteries contained in this continent. After all, this continent was formed from the aura of the demonic realm. Since there were demonic sages in the demonic realm, and over 300,000 beings who were suspected to have stepped onto the steps, there would naturally be more cultivators whose cultivation realms were not as high as these beings, but were just as profound. Among such a large number of auras with such a uniform distribution of cultivation realms, there were of course some that a primordial pure yang saint could understand. For example, the auras of the more profound primordial pure yang cultivators and the auras of the weaker connate grand luo cultivators. Compared to the continent, these numerous auras were so minuscule that they were negligible. In fact, they were suppressed to the point of collapse by those powerful auras. The space that they could occupy might even be sand, rocks, or a small tree or a blade of grass. This was also the reason why the divine had not been able to discover them in the past 10 years. However, no matter how minuscule, negligible, and oppressive they were, they still existed after all. Although Holiness's eyesight was much weaker than that of Luo Fan, it was still powerful enough for him to see every detail on the continent beyond the huge whirlpool, such as the rocks and the small tree. By comparing what he saw, the appearance of the continent in this timeline, with what he saw in the distant timeline, Holiness finally discovered the most extraordinary things, that he could clearly sense the flow of time was several times faster than normal. For Holiness, this was the difference between what he could understand and what he could not understand. It was the difference in the flow of time. For those things that were beyond his understanding, even if he tried to comprehend them for billions of years, he would not be able to comprehend them. Instead, he would feel that it was natural and normal. Even if time flowed faster, there would not be any abnormalities. As for those things that he could understand and were still within his understanding, as long as there was a slight abnormality, he would naturally be able to discover it. As for the mysteries that surpassed the connate grand luo cultivators and stepped into the sage-to-be level, Holiness could not comprehend them at all. In his view, everything was normal. Even if there was a comparison, he could only sense the abnormality in the flow of time through the results. But as for the things that he could understand and imagine, he could discover the entire process of development and the details of the change in the flow of time. In other words, he could discover the abnormality in the flow of time. For this continent, he could discover that the flow of time was indeed several times faster than normal. And according to this logic, the more he could understand and the more mysteries within his understanding, the closer he felt it to the truth. In other words, the faster the flow of time was. Chapter 1193. While he was overjoyed to find the small tree that contained the mysteries of the primordial unity pure yang level, his mind was also filled with an indescribable shock. Update fast, none pop-up window pure text word through the state of the small tree. He suddenly understood why the continent looked completely different from reality in his eyes. He understood that in this continent, the matter that was larger than the small tree contained mysteries that surpassed the limits of his understanding. For a sacred being who had gradually become interested in cultivation and had gradually found joy in it, one could imagine the degree of shock he felt when he discovered this. I can't believe it's like this. This is a treasure that I can excavate for eternity. This thought flashed through his mind, and the light in his eyes became even more intense. Unfortunately, even though he had discovered all of this, he could only stay here and look at the distant continent. He did not know how far away he was. He could only observe the continent that could bring him endless benefits and allow his cultivation level to increase tremendously. With his ability, it was impossible for him to pass through the obstruction of the vortex and personally head to that continent. He had thought of thousands of ways, but still could not complete the breakthrough. Feeling helpless, he could only sit cross-legged at the edge of the whirlpool and look up at the distant continent, absorbing the mysteries of the primordial pure yang level that he could understand. Although the distance was extremely far, and he could only observe it with his eyes, The mysteries he obtained were many times less than the original mysteries contained on it. However, there were many things that contained the mysteries of Primordial Yang level, so the number of things added up had reached a very shocking level. Gradually, the saint was immersed in the supreme mysteries of Primordial Yang level. As he immersed himself in the endless mysteries, his body gradually emanated an extraordinary aura that belonged to a primordial expert. It made him look otherworldly, as if he could vanish with the wind at any time. The feeling of transcending the mortal world. Primeval 1232, the power in his body began to circulate slowly as he comprehended it, producing all sorts of subtle adjustments and changes, transforming towards a higher, more exquisite, and more indescribable level. When Luo Fan first created the Tao fruit Tao, he had yet to attain the immortal Tao and attain the earth immortal Tao fruit. Even though Pangu's primordial spirit played a part in that, it was enough to show that creating a cultivation method did not require an incredible level of cultivation. Primordial pure yang level was more than enough for a self-created technique. Although the technique taught by Luo Fan was extremely exquisite, it was, after all, created by him casually. It was only aimed at the holiness of that time. After the divine's cultivation level increased, their knowledge changed and their mentality changed. This kind of cultivation method was actually not very suitable for the divine. In other words, such a technique. For the divine, there was already room for improvement. If the divine were an ordinary cultivator, after witnessing the unimaginable power of Luo Fan, they would certainly feel a sense of awe. Even if they felt that the cultivation method was not suitable for them, they would only feel that they were cultivating in the wrong way and that they were cultivating on the right path. They would not think that it was a problem with the cultivation method. Too many advertisements? A pop-up window? The interface was fresh, and the advertisements on the entire website would make one think that they needed to modify the cultivation method to better cultivate. But the divine was different. He had been the great sage of the Supreme Divine Land for tens of billions of years, and the Supreme Divine Land was the most powerful superpower in the entire universe that had allowed him to occupy the pinnacle of the universe for tens of billions of years. Such a status had allowed him to develop a strong and unparalleled ego, and his awe of everything and every existence was maintained at a level that was much smaller than that of ordinary people. With such a mentality, he felt that the cultivation method was not suitable for him. He felt that those cultivation methods were not suitable for him. Even though he had come into contact with the cultivation methods of the cultivation civilization that were rather unfamiliar to him, he was still fully confident that it was not his fault. It was the cultivation method's fault. With that thought in mind, he naturally began to make adjustments to the cultivation method. Such adjustments were crucial for the divine. As he adjusted, he felt that his body was becoming more agile, and that the power in his body was becoming more and more at his will. Even the many mysteries of the great path that he could not see clearly before became much clearer. The mysteries of the primordial pure yang level that were emanating from that extremely distant continent became more comprehensible in the process, and thus formed a very good cycle, allowing him to set foot on the right path of cultivation that everyone dreamed of. His attainment in the path of cultivation was improving at an unimaginable speed. The divine's cultivation was on the right track, and the path of the cultivation civilization became smoother and smoother as he walked further and further. But outside the world of the crystal wall, the entire supreme divine land, and even the entire universe, had fallen into an extremely terrifying chaos. The entire universe had now erupted into a cosmic war. This cosmic war was not caused by the cultivation nations and the other superpowers, but by the supreme divine land. The fuse of this universe war was when Luo Fan destroyed the 10,000 annihilation cannons in a life danger zone. Extraordinary Primordial 1232 after that. The cultivation faction and the technology faction of the Supreme Divine Land lost their patience and began to have more and more intense conflicts. At a certain moment, the encampment of a cultivation organization was finally completely wiped out by an unknown force, and the absolute climax of the conflict was set off. From that moment on, the battle between the two factions became white-hot. The entire Supreme Divine Land was directly split into two parts, and they began to fiercely attack each other. In such a war, although the cultivation organizations only occupied a small portion of the Supreme Divine Land's power, they had an advantage over the citizens who hated cultivation. That was, they could not only use the power of the laws of the Supreme Divine Land that had been modified by the Supreme Divine Land like the citizens, but they could also perform all kinds of wonderful cultivation techniques. The combination of the two produced an effect that was 10 times or even 100 times stronger than normal. This caused the cultivation organizations to finally stabilize, and they even began to grow stronger, letting the entire universe see their strength. More and more living beings who originally belonged to the technology faction joined the cultivation organizations and began to practice all kinds of cultivation techniques. Seeing this opportunity, the cultivation nations that the gods and the others had established made a prompt decision. They began to send emissaries into the Supreme Divine Land, and they contacted the cultivation organizations, bringing the countless wonderful cultivation techniques created in the cultivation nations to them. Of course, they only gave the more basic ones. The truly powerful and important ones were, of course, kept within the cultivation nations. They did not dare to spread them. With the help of these cultivation techniques, the speed of development of the cultivation organizations skyrocketed by 1,000 times. Although it was only a short period of time, they had already occupied half of the entire Supreme Divine Land. The splitting of the Supreme Divine Land naturally led to the splitting of the entire universe. As the most powerful nation in the entire universe, the status of the Supreme Divine Land was similar to that of the United States on Earth. Almost every nation had either a distant or a close relationship with it. That way, when the Supreme Divine Land split, every nation naturally had to choose a side. They would either join the cultivation organizations or join the side of the technology faction. At first, it was only natural that more nations joined the side of the technology faction, but the more time passed, the more the entire universe discovered the power of cultivation. The more mystical the methods of cultivation were discovered, the more nations naturally joined the cultivation organizations. Once the sides were clearly defined, war was clearly unavoidable. As a result, the entire universe was filled with battlefields. Planets were being destroyed at almost any given moment. Galaxies were being destroyed, and galaxies were being destroyed every single day. The number of living beings who died every day exceeded the limit of the number of numbers. Such conflict, such war. Not only did it cause misfortune for all living beings, but it also caused a subtle change in the rules and laws of the entire universe. The absolute mainstream rules and laws of the technology civilization gradually faded away, and the rejection of the cultivation civilization by the entire universe had weakened by hundreds of times in such a short period of time. Now, living beings did not need to be in the cultivation countries, nor did they need to be in the area affected by the divine breakthrough of the Supreme Divine Land. Instead, it was very easy to successfully cultivate cultivation methods in any place, in any galaxy, or in any galaxy. Even those with extraordinary minds could easily comprehend some shallow cultivation methods. This was already close to a normal, unbiased universe. With such a change in the rules of the universe, the power of the cultivation organizations naturally grew stronger. Just like that, in just a short period of time, the entire universe had unexpectedly formed two balanced camps. The opposition between the cultivation civilization and the technology civilization had begun to enter a stalemate. Even so, war was war after all. While the overall stalemate was a stalemate, there would certainly be countless frictions, and there would definitely be many small and big battles. On the scale of the universe, no matter how small a war was, it would still be a battlefield on a planet, and the number of people who died would at least be counted on a planet by a planet. It seems that the mission that the immortal master gave us is about to be completed. Somewhere in the cultivation countries, an old man with a weathered expression was lamenting. This old man was none other than Shun Tun. When Shun Tun first received the cultivation methods from Luo Fan, he accepted a mission from Luo Fan, which was to spread the cultivation civilization in the universe as much as possible and change the direction of the entire universe from a technological civilization to a cultivation civilization. Even the cultivation methods that he received from Luo Fan were unsealed according to his strength. Therefore, he was most concerned about the power of the cultivation civilization. Even the heavenly gods and the others were far inferior to him in this aspect. It's not that easy. Although the war has entered a stalemate, it will take at least tens of thousands of years of war to have a 40% to 50% chance of achieving true victory. In fact, we might even fail in the end and lose our lives. The heaven god beside Shun Tun sighed and said, compared to Shun Tun, he was more concerned about finding fellow cultivators. He had little interest in reversing the direction of civilization in the entire universe. As such, he was actually opposed to the idea of cultivator nations joining such a war. Unfortunately, Shun Tun's forces in the cultivation world were also extremely powerful. Furthermore, the other cultivators were unwilling to stay out of the war. So when the war swept across the entire universe, the cultivators of Shun Tun and Shun Tun were not willing to stay out of it. As a result, the cultivation nation joined the war and began to fight against the technologically advanced nations, contributing a great deal of power to the entire cultivation nation. Of course, it was also because of this that the entire cultivation nation had become 10 times more dangerous than before. Meanwhile, not too far away from the cultivation nation, several river systems away, this was the front line of the technological civilization. There were hundreds of superpowers eyeing the cultivator countries like tigers watching their prey. They were ready to take advantage of the lack of preparation to destroy the entire cultivation country. Behind and beside the cultivation nation, there were also hundreds of superpowers that had already joined the cultivation nation's side, guarding the front line. Being in such a position, even though the boundless continent had been refined by the immortal master Luo Fan, it was still far stronger than before. Its defense and sturdiness were many times stronger than before, but Empyrean gods still didn't feel safe. It's only several tens of thousands of years. For cultivators who no longer have a lifespan limit, several tens of thousands of years is nothing. Moreover, you're wrong about one thing. Our chances of winning the war aren't just 4 or 5%, but 9%. We have at least a 9% chance of victory. The remaining 1% chance. It's not defeat, it's mutual destruction. The entire universe will be destroyed as a result. Shun Tun said without any hesitation. Your judgment is too arbitrary. The heaven god shook his head and said plainly, it's not that I'm being arbitrary, but you've overlooked something. The rules of the universe have changed. Shun Tun smiled. It has indeed changed. But don't you think this change can't be relied on? If a war like this can change the rules of the universe, then it wouldn't be strange if it were to change back at some point. The heaven god shook his head. It won't change anymore. Shun Tun let out a long sigh. He let out a long breath, a faint smile on his face, and his eyes were filled with longing. It's like a seesaw. In order to raise one side and sink the other, one must exert force on the sinking side. Moreover, it must be continuously applied. Once that force is withdrawn, then the seesaw will return to balance. The two sides will return to balance. The universe in the past was like a seesaw with one side high and the other low. It's not how nature should behave. Instead, it's a special state formed by some special force or mechanism. That force or mechanism needs to be maintained at all times in order to maintain it. In the current universe, the technological civilization and the cultivation civilization are in a state of balance. This is the true state of nature. The appearance of this state means that that force or mechanism has been removed and broken. Without that force or mechanism, the universe can no longer return to its original state where the technological civilization dominated and the cultivation civilization was completely excluded. Shun Tun said. Although he had occasionally thought of these words before, he had never said them so clearly. This time he said them in full. He wasn't just saying them for the heaven god to hear, but also for himself to hear. After he said that, he felt his body and mind empty. In the depths of his memory, an invisible seal suddenly appeared and then collapsed. As the seal collapsed, endless characters, diagrams, cultivation comprehension, and cultivation profundities surged out from the seal. They instantly filled his memories and filled his entire mind. The speed at which the endless information flowed out completely surpassed his processing speed. He couldn't help but stand there in a daze. His eyes seemed to be filled with countless complicated and profound diagrams. While the heaven god was thinking about what Shintan said, he suddenly realized that Shintan was standing there in a daze. He couldn't help but be shocked. He looked up and instantly saw the change in Shintan's eyes. He suddenly recalled the things he learned from his communication with Shintan over the years. He couldn't help but smile bitterly. His eyes instantly became a little envious and emotional. Even the immortal elder agreed with you. Looks like you're right, he muttered to himself. He didn't say anything and didn't leave. He just quietly stayed by Shintan's side and waited for him to come back to his senses. Back then, he had heard Shintan talk about what happened when Luo Fan enlightened him. He knew that there was actually a seal hidden in the depths of Shintan's memory. It was a seal that would continuously be unsealed according to the completion of the mission. It contained countless supreme cultivation mysteries and contained the method to reach the absolute truth and obtain supreme transcendence. After knowing this, Shintan's current behavior was obvious. The seal had been completely unsealed, and the endless cultivation mysteries that were sealed within the seal were completely unleashed. For a heaven god who had completely become a cultivator and wholeheartedly pursued the absolute truth and supreme transcendence, it was easy to imagine the envy and emotion he felt. However, after all, Shintan had formed a deep friendship with him. Even if he was envious or emotional, he didn't feel any jealousy, which was why he was able to remain so calm. Shintan stood there for 3 days and 3 nights. After waiting for 3 days and 3 nights, the huge amount of information that surged out of the seal gradually disappeared. Only then did he gradually return to his senses. Chapter 1194. After he snapped back to reality, Shintan's eyes seemed to have turned into 2 deep universes. The light of wisdom in his eyes was so bright that it was almost scorching. The heaven god who was watching Shintan's transformation was shocked by the light. His jaw dropped, and his expression was one of both sadness and happiness. After a long time, he finally recovered and said, "Congratulations on completing your cultivation." "Same to you." At this moment, Shintan was extremely happy. Hearing those words, he began to speak incoherently. The heaven god could not help but smile bitterly when he heard his reply. He knew that Shintan was excited and did not say much. He waited for Shintan to snap back to reality. Shintan was not a simple person after all. He quickly regained his composure and said, "I lost my composure just now. Please forgive me. You and I have known each other for many years. How can I not understand? Was it the seal that the immortal elder left in your memory that disappeared?" The heaven god smiled. That's right. Shintan was overjoyed when he mentioned this. He could not help but smile. I finally know what cultivation is and how to cultivate. The feeling of opening my eyes and seeing the world is amazing. The things that Luo Fan had sealed in Shintan's memory were the common knowledge and theories of cultivation that a normal cultivator should know. They were also things that he had created for Shintan. They were completely compatible with his body and were of the same origin as the cultivation method that he was cultivating. However, they were much more advanced and could lead to the supreme cultivation method of a Tao Lord. Not to mention this specialized cultivation method, even the common knowledge and principles of cultivation were enough for Shintan to be reborn. He would grow from a dabbler into a real cultivator and become a powerful being who truly pursued transcendence and eternity. The cultivation method that was specially created for him gave her a path to follow in her pursuit, and it was no longer illusory. The combination of these 2 things was extremely important to Shintan. The importance of these two things was unimaginable. With such a reward, Shun Tun instantly felt like the thick fog in front of him had dissipated. The originally illusory and supreme goal no longer seemed so illusory. Vaguely, there seemed to be a golden path extending in front of him that led straight to the supreme goal. He could not help but lose his composure after receiving such a huge reward. He could not help but feel excited. The heavenly deity was envious of Shun Tun's performance. Although he would not be jealous of Shun Tun's gains, he was not completely happy for Shun Tun either. Their relationship had not reached such a stage yet. At this moment, he looked at the joyful and excited Shun Tun. After all, he was still depressed that he did not obtain such a reward. Seeing that the god village no longer needed his protection, he didn't want to stay here any longer. He bid farewell to the god village and went to cultivate on his own. Shun Tun had already recovered from his excitement. After all, he was not naturally dumb, so he could tell what the kami was thinking. With a thought, he smiled and said, "Fellow Taoist, you don't have to be too anxious. I've gained a lot today and learned a lot of common knowledge and principles of cultivation. However, these things weren't taught to me by a mortal senior alone. Why don't we arrange an opportunity together? How about I explain these principles to everyone?" Hearing this, the heavenly god's eyes lit up. Weren't those cultivation principles specially taught to you by the immortal elders? Of course not. Although some of them were specially given to me, most of them are common knowledge and principles of cultivation. I believe that a mortal senior purposely used me to spread these principles, Shun Tun said with a smile. If that's the case, there's no need to wait any longer. I'll inform the others to come. Once you explain it to us, we'll see which ones can be spread and which ones need to be treated with caution. The heavenly god's eyes lit up as he spoke. Okay, it didn't matter who he talked to. It didn't matter when he talked to them. Shun Tun naturally did not object to the heavenly god's suggestion. He immediately agreed. As soon as he agreed, the heavenly god began to move. Rays of light shot out from his hands and spread to every corner of the cultivation nation. They quickly reached where Yin Hua and the others were at. To Yin Hua and the others, this piece of good news was extremely urgent. At that moment, the entire cultivation nation seemed to become noisy. Many people who had been enlightened by Luo Fan began to rush toward where the heavenly god and Shun Tun were. After informing the others of the news, the heavenly god began to ask the Shun Tun about the information that Luo Fan had prepared. He wanted to know which of the information could be spread, which was only useful to the Shun Tun, and which was either useless to others or harmful to them. Although he was not as fortunate as Shun Tun and did not receive as much cultivation knowledge from Luo Fan as one of the first two cultivators who were enlightened by Luo Fan, the heavenly god was still more knowledgeable than Shun Tun. In terms of status, he was also slightly higher than Shun Tun. Therefore, he was more confident than Shun Tun. Since Shun Tun had decided to spread the knowledge of cultivators, there was no need for him to hide anything. He began to explain the various aspects of cultivation to the Empyrean god in detail, such as the taboos of cultivation, the basic refining methods of magic tools, the classification of magic tools, the grades of magic treasures, the various methods of alchemy, the treasures of the heavens and the earth. Apart from a specific content, he explained everything to the Empyrean god in detail. As the heavenly god listened to all of this information, his eyes became slightly red, and his expression became more and more excited. With these, the absolute truth will no longer be shrouded in clouds and mist. After all, the power of the entire cultivation faction will increase 1,000-fold. 10,000 times. He muttered. At this moment, he understood why Shun Tun lost his composure and was so excited when he first regained his senses. Because at this moment, he was even more excited than Shun Tun and lost his composure. After all, the Empyrean god was not an ordinary person. He quickly recovered and began to think about what could be spread and what could not be spread. The taboos of cultivation must be made public. Just this alone will definitely double the number of cultivators in the entire universe. The basic refining methods of magic tools and the classification of magic tools should also be made public. However, some of the refining methods that are too powerful and have too obvious weaknesses must not be made public. We must prevent the technological faction from obtaining these methods and developing countermeasures. Next, the Empyrean analyzed all of the information that Shun Tun mentioned. Could this information be made public? How much could it be made public? Why could it only be made public to this extent? Why couldn't this information be made public? Just like that, Shun Tun tore apart the information that Shun Tun said, causing him to be in awe of the Empyrean god. Although I'm favored by the immortal master, I can't compare to him when it comes to thinking. This thought appeared in his mind. After the Empyrean analyzed all of the information and roughly determined the division between the information that could be made public and the information that could not be made public, Yanhua, who was closest to this place, turned into a ball of fire and landed in front of this cave abode. Yanhua landed in front of this cave abode as a ball of fire. Do you really know the cultivation principles of the immortal master? Yanhua shouted as soon as he landed. The Empyrean god and Shun Tun smiled at each other and left the cave abode. This cave abode was originally Shun Tun's cave abode. This time, Shun Tun and the Empyrean gathered together to study the current situation of the universe. They would decide what the entire cultivation country would do next. After leaving the cave abode, they saw the young man who was covered in flames rushing into the cave abode. If it wasn't for the heavy defenses around the cave abode, he might have already entered the depths of the cave abode. Of course it's true. How can you joke about something like this? Shun Tun smiled. Just as he said, if this was used as a joke, it would be a joke. If it was used as a joke, it would definitely offend a lot of people. If it was a narrow-minded person, they might even turn against him. Hearing this, Yanhua was overjoyed. He said, "That's good. That's good. Okay, let's get ready. There are many people coming down. We need to set up defenses before we can preach the cultivation principles. Who knows, someone might be using some special method to spy on us," the Empyrean god said. "You're worrying too much. We have so many defenses here. How could someone spy on us without being discovered?" Yanhua pouted. However, even though he said that, he didn't dare to hesitate at all. After all, this matter was too important. No matter how many preparations they made, it would not be too much. It was just a precaution. So what if they set up a few methods to prevent people from spying on them? Immediately, the three of them began to move, each using their own techniques. Various types of light flashed, and various types of power surged out. Various types of materials began to appear and were distributed around the cave mansion. Gradually, an exquisite and indescribable great formation was constructed, gradually separating the space around the cave mansion from the outside world. This separation of space-time did not have much defensive or combat ability. However, it could isolate everything as much as possible. Even the space-time was no longer the same. Naturally, it was almost impossible to spy on them. As they constructed the defenses and separated space-time, more and more cultivators flew over from all over the cultivation country and entered the formation. After all, they were all extraordinary people. After they landed, they did not waste any time talking to the Empyrean god and Shun Tun. They quickly joined in the construction of the formation and increased the speed at which the formation was being constructed. This process lasted for 10 days and 10 nights before it ended. After such a long time, even Go Likun and the others, who were hundreds of thousands of light years away from the cave abode, had already arrived. Once everyone was gathered, Shun Tun began to explain the matter clearly. At that time, the crowd was truly emotional. All the cultivators were extremely excited. They looked at Shun Tun like a pervert who had been holding back for 3 years, seeing a beautiful woman. Their gazes made Shun Tun's heart shiver slightly. Immediately, he did not dare to delay and explain the various cultivator knowledge to everyone. Back then, it had taken him 3 days and 3 nights to receive the information. If he wanted to explain the principles of cultivation so that everyone could hear and understand it clearly, it would definitely take more time than just a few days and nights. This time, the lecture lasted for 10 years. During these 10 years, the formation that they had set up was constantly in operation. The location of the cave abode was completely isolated from the outside world. All the cultivators, equipment, and detection equipment outside could not detect anything that was happening inside, nor could they hear anything that was happening inside. It was as if the space-time inside the formation was no longer in this universe. It was as if it was in a completely different space-time. During these 10 years, the battle between the cultivation camp and the technology camp was still ongoing throughout the entire universe. At the front line where the cultivation camp was located, there were also hundreds of battles that were neither too big nor too small. The number of living beings from both camps was as high as thousands of planets. The victories and defeats between the two camps were not one-sided. Instead, there were victories and defeats for both camps. Sometimes, the cultivation camp won and occupied some of the solar systems of the technology camp. Other times, the technology camp won and occupied some of the solar systems of the cultivation camp. Just like that, one side lost while the other gained. The concept of a stalemate was vividly displayed as a powerful force of the cultivation camp. Although the overall strength of the cultivation camp was somewhat affected after losing the control of the heavenly gods and the others, the current system of the cultivation camp was quite perfect. Even without the control of the upper echelons, the operation of the entire system could still exert a considerable amount of power. Therefore, the inaction of the heavenly gods and the others did not affect the strength of the cultivation camp too much. There were no irreversible consequences. Of course, this was only in terms of the strength displayed. The impact on the hearts of the people of the cultivation camp was not the same. The heavenly gods and the others were known to be the group of people with the highest level of cultivation in the entire universe. They were also the psychological beacon of the entire cultivation camp. For 10 years, not a single sound was heard, and not a single person could be seen. This caused the members of the cultivation camp to gradually develop an inexplicable sense of irritation. They almost began to suspect that something had happened to them, and thus began to doubt whether the cultivation camp could succeed this change. In a short period of time, it could still be reversed, but if this continued for a long time, it would certainly lead to irreversible consequences. In the end, it could even lead to the collapse of the cultivation camp. Just as everyone in the cultivation camp was becoming more and more irritable and doubtful, the great formation that completely isolated the inside and outside of the cultivation camp finally shook. It collapsed with a loud rumble. As the great formation collapsed, dozens of incomparably powerful auras soared into the sky, shaking the clouds in the sky and causing all sorts of strange phenomena to appear. It was a declaration to the entire cultivation camp that a powerful existence had appeared. At this moment, almost the entire cultivation camp was paying attention to the state of the cultivation nations. In just a few short hours, all the cultivation nations in the universe knew about this matter. The dozens of powerful existences that emerged from the collapsing formation were, of course, the heavenly gods, the Shintuan, and the others. Compared to 10 years ago, at this very moment, all of their auras had changed slightly. They had become more graceful and more suited to the path of cultivation. The deeply rooted aura brought about by technological civilization that could not be erased, even after listening to Luo Fan's sermons, had weakened to the point where it had almost completely disappeared. It was because they had listened to the Shintuan sermons about the various common knowledge and principles of cultivation that their worldview had gradually changed, allowing them to gradually change the worldview brought about by technological civilization to the worldview of the cultivation civilization. This change in worldview was, of course, fundamentally different from the worldview they had truly sorted out, but this change in worldview was enough to bring them great benefits. The change in their auras was only superficial. Most importantly, they had begun to think like cultivators. In the future, when they cultivated, it would be easier for them to comprehend the principles of cultivation from the various realities of reality. They would also be more likely to be inspired by the various realities of reality, which would allow their cultivation to improve even faster. This wasn't hard to understand. In the past, When they hadn't changed their worldview, they would instinctively analyze something from the perspective of a technological civilization. They would think of an object as a molecular component, an atomic component, an electron, a neutron, or a proton. But now, their worldview had changed to that of the cultivation camp. When they saw something, the first thought that came to their minds was the principles of cultivation contained within, the mysteries of yin and yang conversion, and what principles could be integrated into cultivation. These two differences made it obvious at a glance which was more suitable for cultivation, and which was more suitable for improving one's cultivation. On that day, Kami represented the cultivation nation to notify all the nations in the cultivation camp. In order to increase the strength of the cultivation camp, the cultivation nation had decided to publicize a large number of the mysteries of cultivation, allowing the various nations in the cultivation camp to send people over to listen to the sermons. This news was like a stone that caused 1,000 ripples, instantly throwing the entire universe into chaos. The cultivation nations were naturally overjoyed and excited, but the technological nations were terrified. They began to attack the cultivation camp in a frenzy, try to prevent the cultivation camp from becoming stronger. Unfortunately, the plans of the technological nations were clearly not going to succeed. The reason why the two camps had entered a stalemate at this time was because both sides were evenly matched in strength. No matter how crazily they attacked, they could not stop the cultivation nations from sending people over to listen to the sermons. As a result, the actions of Kami and the others were like the straw that broke the camel's back, gradually tilting the entire universe in favor of the cultivation camp. Update quickly. No pop-up windows, pure text. Chapter 1195. The widespread dissemination of common knowledge about cultivation caused more and more living beings in the universe to turn to the cultivation camp. After all, compared to the technological civilizations that relied on external objects and could only rely on modification or some technological means to obtain power and a long lifespan, the attraction of the cultivation camp was much stronger. Even if they were beings of the technological faction, they were still living beings. Since they were living beings, they would definitely look forward to using their own power to unleash unimaginable abilities and change the face of the world more than using other external objects to do so. And this was the difference between the cultivation camp and the technological civilization. The cultivation camp was more about unearthing one's own potential, unearthing one's own everything in order to obtain supreme power and an infinite lifespan. On the other hand, although the technological civilization could also allow living beings to obtain various abilities, these abilities could only be obtained by modifying themselves or by manipulating external objects. Because of this commonality among living beings, as common knowledge about cultivation was widely disseminated, more and more living beings gained a deeper understanding of cultivation. And this understanding made them realize that cultivation was not like what the science and technology camp had propagated in the past, that it was an evil thing that would cause great damage to the entire universe, and that it would eventually lead to the complete destruction of the entire universe. With this, they would naturally be curious about cultivation and would want to master this wonderful ability themselves. Just like that, the power of the cultivation camp grew stronger and stronger as time went by, and the situation of the entire universe changed dramatically almost every day. Faced with such a situation, the technological camp became more and more frenzied. The war that spread across the entire universe did not calm down because of the increasing gap in strength between the two sides. Instead, it became more and more tragic because of this. The number of casualties was 10 times or even 100 times more than during the stalemate. Almost every moment, there were planets being destroyed in the entire universe, and every day, there would be a country being destroyed in the war. This kind of war went on for 100 years. The people of the cultivation camp discussed and decided to stop fighting. They made peace with the technological camp. This was not because the cultivation camp was unable to expand and could not withstand the consumption of war. In fact, it was the opposite. At this moment, the power of the entire cultivation camp had almost occupied the entire universe. The power of the technological camp had been suppressed to the point of shrinking into a ball. With half of the supreme divine land as the edge, there is a star field with an area of trillions of light years. Such a star field was not even 1/10,000th of the size of the entire universe. It wasn't even 1/10,000th of the difference. From this, one could see the disparity in power between the science and technology camp and the cultivation camp. The reason why the people of the cultivation countries were negotiating with the technological faction was very simple. It was because the technological faction possessed enough power to destroy the entire universe, causing the entire universe and all living beings within it, including all the forces of the cultivation faction, to be buried with them. According to their calculations, this was already the limit of what the technological civilization could endure. If they continued to pressure the technological faction, making them feel that the cultivation faction was going to wipe them out, making them feel that waiting would only lead to despair, then it was highly likely that the technological faction would engage in a life-and-death struggle, activating those weapons that could destroy the entire universe, to perish together with the cultivation camp. It was just like on Earth, if two countries possessed nuclear weapons. Even if there was a huge disparity in their overall national strength, the stronger country would never be able to force the weaker country too far. However, although it was the cultivation camp that planned to negotiate, it seemed that they were at a disadvantage. But obviously, with such a huge disparity in strength, the technology faction didn't have the confidence to raise any excessive conditions. They were just doing their best to protect their own faction's interests under normal circumstances. In the end, after another 10 years, the peace treaty between the cultivation camp and the technology camp was finally signed. The treaty stipulated the division of territory between the two camps. Of course, this was the territory occupied by each side when the peace treaty was signed. The cultivation camp naturally couldn't voluntarily give up their territory to the technology camp, and the technology camp couldn't give up their territory to the cultivation camp. It was also stipulated that the two sides wouldn't attack each other, that the cultivation camp couldn't spread cultivation techniques within the technology camp, and that the technological products of the technology camp couldn't enter the cultivation camp at will, and so on and so forth. If so many incomparably complicated rules were recorded on paper, it could even become a huge book that was taller than a person. Unlike the peace treaty signed between countries on ordinary planets, the power that both the technological faction and the cultivation faction possessed had already reached an inconceivable level. It was enough to have a profound impact on the fundamental laws of the entire universe. Therefore, after the peace treaty was signed, it wasn't just a treaty on paper. It was directly engraved in the depths of the fundamental laws of the universe, affecting the fundamental laws of the entire universe. Everything recorded in the treaty would naturally become the laws of the universe, naturally containing a powerful restrictive force. The interior of the technological faction's territory would naturally produce an extreme rejection against cultivation. This rejection was even hundreds or thousands of times stronger than the rejection that existed in the universe at the very beginning. It was to the extent that any cultivator who stepped into it would cause the entire universe to surge and produce countless tribulations to bombard and destroy them. But in the cultivation faction's territory, the situation was completely reversed. It created countless convenient conditions for the cultivation civilization, and the density of the world's vitality was increasing almost every moment. Any environment that was originally harsh would become more and more suitable for cultivation as time passed. For living beings, as long as they had the slightest inclination towards Tao, they could even come into contact with the laws of the universe, faintly sense the various invisible laws that existed in the universe, and sense the vague great Tao. Some geniuses didn't even need guidance to naturally comprehend many exquisite cultivation techniques, greatly enriching the cultivation legacies of the entire cultivation camp. Such a change was beyond the expectations of the two camps that had signed the treaty. When they sensed the changes in the universe, the two sides that had signed the treaty were somewhat caught off guard. However, relatively speaking, the technology camp was somewhat relieved despite being caught off guard. On the other hand, the cultivation camp was somewhat dissatisfied. This was very normal. For the technological faction, their original ability to resist was to drag the other party into mutual destruction. The signing of the treaty was a powerful form of protection for them. Naturally, they were quite glad. As for the cultivation faction, they were originally only afraid that the other party would drag them into mutual destruction. The treaty was only to appease the technological faction. In fact, they had even planned a series of actions, preparing to gradually assimilate the technological faction and eventually completely destroy the technological faction's ability to drag the universe into mutual destruction. The entire universe would then change from the original technological universe to the cultivation universe. But now this happened. How could their plan still be carried out? Naturally, they were quite dissatisfied. But no matter how dissatisfied they were, the treaty had already been signed, and the fundamental laws of the universe had changed. What was done, and what was done was done. Both sides could only swallow this result. The entire universe thus obtained true peace. Originally, the Shintoan and Heavenly God Project would have been at war for tens of thousands of years. It had only been a short 100 years, and it had already ended. I didn't expect it to end so quickly. Shintoan sighed in his cave abode in the cultivation nation. Next to him, Shun Deng, who had already cleared up the misunderstanding and built a good relationship with Shintoan, nodded and said, "Indeed, I thought it would take at least a few thousand years for it to end." A few thousand years? Your calculations are more accurate than mine. I thought it would take tens of thousands of years. Shintoan chuckled when he heard this. You two are so jealous. Beside them, Fireworks finally couldn't stand it anymore. She interrupted. Hee, how is this jealousy? Don't you think this cosmic war ended faster than you expected? Shintoan chuckled. The current Shintoan was no longer a beginner demi-saint. Instead, he had become a beginner demi-saint. In just a short 100 years, he had already surpassed a realm that would normally take millions or tens of millions of years. Even Luo Fan could not compare to his speed of improvement. The reason why he was able to improve so quickly was because of the cultivation knowledge and principles that he had obtained over 100 years ago. The cultivation knowledge and principles were not enough to push his cultivation realm to such a huge leap. However, this knowledge and these principles, as well as the cultivation method that Luo Fan had specially created for him, made up for what he lacked in the past. This made up for his lack of potential. It allowed his past accumulation to quickly transform into his cultivation realm, pushing his cultivation realm past the beginner demi-saint realm and into a beginner demi-saint realm. Similar to him, everyone else had more or less improved. For example, Fireworks had broken through the innate Grand Luo and entered the demi-saint realm. She was a beginner demi-saint, while Shun Deng was only one step away from becoming an innate Grand Luo. Isn't it better to end it quickly? Although we don't occupy the entire universe, we have turned the entire universe into a cultivation universe. Turning the entire universe into a cultivation universe. But in the territory we occupy, all the rules have become so suitable for cultivation. Even a pig, as long as it has a heart for Tao, can cultivate a supreme divine ability. Would it be better than this? Yanhua curled her lips as she spoke. Huh. When Shin Tun heard this, he laughed and said, "This is indeed a pleasant surprise, but it doesn't change the fact that the war ended too quickly. What's wrong with us talking about it here?" Fireworks was rendered speechless by such a response. All she could do was snort. That being said, what should we do now? Are we just going to keep cultivating like this? At this moment, Go Lakun asked with a frown. Although he did not gain as much as Shintoan, who had directly surpassed the beginner demi-saint realm and became a beginner demi-saint realm, he had raised his cultivation realm to the peak of the beginner demi-saint realm. He only needed one last opportunity to become a beginner demi-saint. His words caused the dozen or so cultivators present to fall silent. If it was an orthodox cultivator, then there was naturally no need for them to answer this question. When they didn't have any chores to attend to, they would naturally cultivate wholeheartedly seek the supreme truth of the Grand Tao, seek eternal lifespan, and seek the supreme fruit of the Tao that would never die. However, although they had changed their worldview to that of cultivators, they were still not orthodox cultivators. Ever since they started cultivating, although they each had their own goals, there was an even greater and even more unattainable goal: to change the fundamental rules of the entire universe, to turn this technological universe into a cultivation universe. This seemed almost impossible in the past. This goal, which they had thought that even if they cultivated to the peak of cultivation, they might not be able to achieve, left a deep mark in all of their hearts. They could not help but place their hearts and souls on this great cause. At this moment, this goal, which was originally almost impossible to achieve, had been achieved. Naturally, they felt an indescribable emptiness. They urgently needed to find a goal that was more powerful than their own cultivation to fill this emptiness. That was why Go Lacoon asked that question. The others also fell silent and did not know how to answer that question. I think that since we have completed the mission given to us by the Immortal Senior, perhaps we should find a chance to meet the Immortal Senior. At this moment, Shun Deng broke the silence. Meet the Immortal Senior? Everyone's eyes lit up when they heard that. What he said made sense. After completing the mission given to them by someone, it was naturally time to submit the mission, collect the reward for the mission, or accept another mission. They would think about it when the time came. That's right. What we need to do now is to find the Immortal Senior. We need to report that we have more or less completed the mission given to us by the Immortal Senior. Shin Tun was overjoyed. That's how it should be, everyone said with a smile. They want to find Luo Fan. Of course, these people were confused and didn't know where to look for it. That was for sure. Luo Fan did not treat them as his personal disciples. He had only met them on a whim and did not leave any contact information with them. It was easy for him to find them, but if they wanted to find him, don't even think about it. However, although they did not know how to directly contact Luo Fan, they were not ordinary people. Everyone could think of the obvious indirect method. I will need you to do it. Shun Tun bowed at the Heaven God and said. The Heaven God could not help but smile bitterly. You want me to do this? No one but you can do it. Everyone's eyes lit up. They all laughed out loud and praised. The Heaven God was helpless. He knew that he was the only one who could do it. After all, he had spent the most time with him. Helpless. He could only sigh and leave the cave abode. He kowtowed to the sky and prayed. Half a day later, light and shadow twisted in the sky, and gradually, the shadow of a majestic palace gradually appeared. When the palace appeared, everyone present was shocked. Although they had seen this palace countless times, every time they saw it, they still felt a kind of shock that came from the bottom of their hearts. The palace looked ordinary at first glance, but as long as they carefully sensed it, they could feel the vast divine power it contained. Although all of them were many times stronger than when they first saw the palace, when they looked at it again, the palace was still unfathomable and majestic. They still felt that the palace could erase all traces of their existence in time and space with just a wave of its aura. In the face of such a palace, even though they had become the rulers of the cultivation camp, they did not dare to be reserved. They immediately knelt with the Heaven God and said, Welcome, exalted immortal. This palace was none other than the creation god's hall, the treasure that Luo Fan had refined. Why did you ask me to come out? Do you know how busy I am? An impatient girl's voice came from the palace, causing everyone's faces to stiffen. This exalted immortal strength was terrifying, but his personality made it difficult for people to respect him. Since the Heaven God was pushed out by everyone, he was the only one who answered the question of the creation god boy. At that moment, he explained the situation in concise words, saying that they had completed the task given by the Immortal Elder and were now planning to see the Immortal Elder. However, they did not have any connections and hoped that the exalted immortal could give them some pointers. The creation god boy had a doppelganger here, so of course he had a clear grasp of the situation in this universe. She knew most of the content of the Heaven God's speech. Only the thoughts of the God of Heaven and the others were somewhat out of his expectations. You want to see the master? She asked in surprise. Yes. Everyone had already guessed the relationship between the creation god Hall and Luo Fan, so they were not surprised to hear this. They just pretended not to hear it and answered in unison. Why do you want to see the master? Even I am so busy. How can the master have time to see you? The creation god boy heard everyone nodding and said disdainfully, I hope that the exalted immortal can inform the master. The heaven god had no choice but to beg. Chapter 1196. If it was a practitioner who didn't know the boy of creation, he would have been frightened by him and wouldn't have dared to say anything more. However, it was very clear that everyone present was extremely familiar with the god creation boy, especially the god of heaven, who had an extremely deep understanding of her. Although his expression was rather nervous and uneasy, in his heart, he did not think that this matter would end like this, and there would not be any chance. He immediately sent a lot of flattery to the boy of creation, such as how the mighty immortal loved the world, how the mighty immortal had absolute power, and so on. Those who could get in touch with him, and those who couldn't, were all sent to the boy of creation. The boy of creation, who was a little angry at being disturbed, was gradually moved by these words, and his mood gradually improved. Seeing that it was effective, the others didn't want to fall behind and sent flattery one after another. Although they rarely flattered people, they were, after all, powerful beings who controlled the whole cultivation camp. They had stayed in the country of science and technology for a long time, so they had seen and heard countless things. How to flatter people, how to make people happy. They naturally had a lot of experience. At first, they were a little awkward, but the more they used it, the smoother it became. In the end, any creature who rose to power by flattery would be so ashamed that they would commit suicide. That kind of mushy degree, that kind of pleasing to the ear, was almost like a deluge of heavenly flowers. The God-creating boy, who had maintained some sanity and knew that he had to maintain his identity, felt dizzy and almost forgot everything. He only knew that there was something there. Really? Am I really so great? I didn't know that I was so strong. Now I know. Oh, no wonder I did that instinctively. I didn't know that I had such a deep meaning. Ha ha. You guys are too much. I'm not that great. That kind of childish nature was really revealed. This kind of bootlicking went on for a day and a night. At this time, even though the boy of creation was flattered so beautifully, he felt a little embarrassed. Finally, he came back to his senses and talked about what they said at the beginning. You said you wanted to see the master? She said. Hearing this, the Kami and the others heaved a sigh of relief. Even fighting a war isn't this tiring. You finally mentioned the most fundamental purpose. It really wasn't easy. However, even though they thought this way, they could not say it out loud. They nodded their heads repeatedly and sent another round of flattery to the heavenly immortal. The God creation boy was proud of himself again. Since you were so sincere, I'll give it to you. I think Master should be able to understand and won't blame me for disturbing him. So wait for my news. Hearing this, the people present were overjoyed, but they also cursed inwardly. How can you see our sincerity? Could it be that we are good at kissing ass? Does it represent our sincerity just because we shoot it in a mushy and desperate way? Of course, this kind of unspoken criticism was only unspoken criticism after all. Naturally, their mouths were filled with a great wave of gratitude. Amidst the flattery, boy creation God took back his incarnation with satisfaction. His mind followed the connection between the incarnation and the original body to where his original body was. The connection between the incarnation and the original body was mysterious to an unimaginable extent. This speed could not be measured by speed at all. In an instant, the boy creation God's consciousness had traversed a distance of countless light years, passed through countless barriers of laws, and directly arrived at a mysterious place. It was a place between the layers of nothingness under the layers of laws. Here, there was an incomparably huge whirlpool that seemed to occupy the entire void layer. In the middle of this whirlpool, there was a huge door. There were traces of cracks on the door. This door was extremely mysterious. It was engraved with countless, unimaginably complex lines, which contained all kinds of indescribable profoundness. At a glance, the boy creation god felt that he had a vague understanding of his own body, as if he had some new understanding of his own body. After looking for a while, boy creation god slightly panicked. He came back to his senses. He did not come here to understand the mystery of this huge door, but to find the location of his original body, and then find the location of his master. Following the connection between the incarnation and the original body, he found that under this door, at first glance, a low continent appeared there, which was almost completely ignored. After all, the spirit-creating boy was a magic treasure of the Town Master realm. Her eyesight was many times stronger than that of the divine. The divine needed to spend 10 years of continuous observation to discover the profound mystery contained in the continent, but the spirit-creating boy could discover the profound truth with just a glance. For a moment, she looked a little dazed. There seemed to be countless mysterious truths pouring into her mind through her eyes, echoing with her original body, which made her feel that she had a deeper control over her original body. This process lasted for several months. One day, boy creation god's body shook slightly, and he suddenly came to his senses. The aura around him suddenly exploded, spreading in all directions, and the next moment, it suddenly shrank and shrank back into his body. This is troublesome. I was flattered again and got carried away. Boy creation god had been immersed in all kinds of mysteries of the continent for several months. At this time, he had already recovered from the state of being flattered. After figuring out the cause and effect, he could not help but feel ashamed. But I have already said it, and now I have to finish it. Otherwise, it will be too embarrassing, she murmured, her face scrunched up, looking extremely cute. Unfortunately, although she had such determination, it was too difficult to fulfill the promise she had made to the divine realm. Even if her original body was with Luo Fan at this time, and the connection between the incarnation and the original body was so close, she could not transmit her thoughts and memories to the original body. Even if her main body was at Luo Fan's place at this time, and the connection between the avatar and the main body was so close, it was still impossible for her to transmit her thoughts and memories to the main body. It was as if there was a mysterious barrier between her incarnation and the original body, blocking the mysterious connection between the incarnation and the original body. This blocking direct connection between her incarnation and the original body was obviously the unimaginably huge vortex in front of her, which seemed to almost occupy the entire void layer, as if the entire void layer was its vortex. What should I do now? This vortex contains enough power to change everything. If I step into it, I may be completely changed. If I become a part of the vortex, it's impossible for me to send a message to the original body. Boy Creation God was having a headache. Damn it, how can there be such a vortex? It can even cut off the connection between the incarnation and the original body. After thinking for a long time, Boy Creation God could not help but curse loudly. She did not think that when Luo Fan wanted to cross this vortex, he had to spend so much energy to complete the broken rune before he could figure out a special way to cross this vortex. If this vortex did not have the power to cut off the connection between the incarnation and the original body, why would he need to do that? What should I do? What should I do? Boy Creation God scratched the back of his head, his face full of worry. He murmured. Suddenly, his eyes lit up, and he saw the other side of the vortex. In a position quite far away from here, there was an old man sitting cross-legged in the air, his eyes fixed on the huge continent in the center of the vortex. He seemed to be mumbling something, and his face was suddenly filled with joy. One moment he was troubled, the next moment he was in pain, the next moment he was filled with murderous intent, and the next moment he was gentle and kind. It was really unpredictable, showing the changes in his heart at this moment. This person must be the cultivator that Master recently enlightened. His cultivation is so low, but he can still understand so many mysteries here. I might as well bring the gods here as well. Let them also understand the Tao here, tell them that Master is here, and let them wait here for Master's call. Thinking of this, Her mood became much better, and a smile gradually appeared on her face. The old man that was seen by the child creation god was obviously a divine being. Boy creation god came here in a straight line according to the feeling of his original body, so he was directly in front of her. In fact, it was the direction where Luo Fan was. As mentioned before, Luo Fan's position was behind the huge portal, so the position that Boy Creation God was facing was also behind the huge portal. The position of the divine was determined according to the huge portal. He was facing a huge portal, so his position was naturally not a small distance from Boy Creation God. Because of this, Boy Creation God did not notice his existence at first, but only discovered his existence when he was feeling irritated and looking around for all kinds of special things. Now, it had been more than 100 years since the divine started to understand the various cultivation mysteries contained in the continent. This bit of time, compared to his lifespan of tens of billions of years, was so insignificant. Naturally, he wouldn't ignore the changes in the outside world during this short period of time. Instead, he focused on cultivating and comprehending the many mysteries that came from the other side. But he did not expect that in this short period of 100 years, the situation of the entire universe had already changed so much. He did not expect that because of his inaction, the camp of science and technology that could at least last for thousands or even tens of thousands of years in the end had shrunk to the point where it could only struggle at death's door in just a short period of 100 years. As for his cultivation realm, because of the comprehension in the past 100 years, it had unknowingly increased by a level. From the original primordial unity, pure yang level to the innate zenith heaven realm. However, even if he'd grown into a golden immortal realm cultivator, it was still far from sufficient when compared to the numerous profundities contained within the continent before him. At this moment, he was still only able to comprehend the various profundities of cultivation revealed by the little tree, grass, and rock. It was because of his cultivation realm that the Boy Creation God was inspired when he saw him and thought of a perfunctory way to brush off her promise. With this idea in mind, the Boy Creation God turned his body and turned into a huge palace again. With another tremble, he directly traveled through time and space, crossing a distance of hundreds of millions of light years, and returned to the top of the god's dwelling in the cultivation nation. With a slight turn, his true appearance was revealed. It was only a few months, and the heavenly gods and the others were waiting for news, so they naturally would not leave just like that. Of course, they would not foolishly wait outside the god's dwelling for news from the Boy Creation God. At this moment, they were either chatting or playing chess in the god's dwelling in 2s and 3s. They were either sparring, drinking tea, or drinking wine. All of them looked calm on the surface, but deep down, they were rather anxious. When the Boy Creation God appeared, he did not conceal his aura. The aura that contained endless power and was enough to shock all cultivators was released without reservation. She felt that she had been deceived by the heavenly gods and the others' flattery. That was why she made a promise that was almost impossible to fulfill, and she was rather dissatisfied with the heavenly gods and the others. At this moment, she simply wanted to take this opportunity to teach the heavenly gods and the others a lesson and make them feel depressed. Therefore, the aura even easily bypassed the defense of the god's dwelling and directly enveloped the heavenly gods and the others. It directly oppressed each of them, causing them to freeze for a moment, and they could no longer continue doing what they had deliberately done to show their calmness. Everyone's mind went blank for a moment, and it took them a while before they could barely think. When their minds started working again, and their minds recovered, everyone knew that the situation was not going well. If it was going well, the exalted immortal would not appear so unhappy at this moment. All of them endured the slightly relaxed aura and hurried to the entrance of the god's dwelling as soon as possible. They bowed to the high and mighty creation god's shrine and greeted the exalted immortal, but they did not mention the matter of asking the Boy Creation God to help them meet the exalted immortal. It was as if that matter had never happened, and that it was the first time they had seen the creation god's shrine in decades. Facing their performance, the boy creation god suddenly felt as if he had punched with all his strength into cotton. He had nowhere to vent his anger. After a while, he barely managed to hold his breath, snorted coldly, and said, "Let's go. The master has no time to deal with you now. Follow me to the place where the master is cultivating in seclusion and wait for the master's summons." After saying that, he was too lazy to talk nonsense with them. The creation god's shrine shook slightly, and an invisible force was released, instantly enveloping the heavenly gods and the other cultivators and pulling them. They were pulled into the incarnation of the creation god's shrine. You guys have it easy. Even if it's an incarnation, you guys are not qualified to step in. The boy creation god placed them in a completely empty space inside the incarnation and muttered in his heart. Then she turned around and, in the same way as before, directly crossed the distance of who knows how many hundreds of millions of light years, directly rushed into the camp of science and technology, rushed into the center of the universe, and rushed into the position that was covered by countless laws and principles. In the blink of an eye, she reappeared next to the huge whirlpool. After appearing here, the boy creation god turned slightly, and the heavenly god and the other dozens of people appeared directly at the edge of the whirlpool. Although the boy creation god did a lot of things, but the heavenly god and the others didn't feel so much. In their feeling, the creation god's shrine just shook slightly, a force wrapped around them, and then there was nothing around them. Then they appeared around a huge whirlpool, and the mysterious palace was suspended above their heads. Master is on the opposite side. With your strength, it's impossible to go there, and it's even impossible to transmit your senses there, so you can only wait here. The boy creation god explained like this, and his figure directly disappeared. He was still a little angry with the heavenly god and the others, and didn't want to talk nonsense with them anymore. The heavenly god and the others didn't care about the boy creation god at this time. At this moment, all of them were shocked by the grand and vast scene in front of them. The peerlessly enormous vortex, the enormous door that even stars seemed like sand before it, and the strange and indescribable world at the edge of the door. All of this caused them to be extremely shocked, and it filled their minds, causing them to be utterly unable to pay attention to anything that was occurring in their surroundings. Where is this place? Such thoughts echoed in the minds of all of them. However, it was obviously impossible to have an answer. They weren't Luo Fan, and they didn't have Luo Fan's insight that almost transcended everything. No matter where it is, this place must have something to do with the foundation of the universe. The heavenly god opened his mouth and said this sentence, which seemed to be a guess, but also very certain. This sentence was a baseless conjecture, and it was absolutely true. Therefore, this sentence was absolutely a guess in essence. However, after one's cultivation realm reached the quasi-sage realm, and was even only a small step away from the minor quasi-sage realm, a cultivator's intuition had already strengthened to a level that ordinary people couldn't imagine. As soon as the heavenly god came here, he naturally had an intuition that this place was incomparably important to the entire universe. It could even decide the survival of the entire universe. From this point of view, this sentence of his could be regarded as a very certain conclusion. When the kami said this, the others had expressions of agreement, shock, or disbelief on their faces. From this difference in expression, it was clear to see the strength of everyone's intuition, and from there, the gap in aptitude and comprehension between them could be determined. To be continued. Chapter 1197. The sky god paid attention to the changes in the people around him and did not explain. Those who understood, understood, but those who did not would not understand, no matter how clearly they explained. Naturally, there was no need to explain too much. The sky god did not immediately observe the extraordinary whirlpool and the huge door in front of him. He carefully observed his surroundings to see if there was anything unusual happening at the edge of the whirlpool. Soon, he noticed the existence of holiness in the distance. He saw that holiness was floating at the edge of the whirlpool, his eyes staring ahead as if he could see through the whirlpool and see the scene on the continent. The expression on his face kept changing, as if there were countless different emotions appearing in his mind at every moment. With just one look, one could tell that he was reaping huge benefits at every moment. The sky god noticed this and could not help but be slightly shocked. Who is this person? Such a thought flashed through his mind. Could it be that he is also a creature that was enlightened by the immortal elder? Then what was his identity? Could it be that he is a higher-up of the supreme divine land? I heard that the supreme divine land originally had a great sage who could destroy the entire universe with his own strength. However, in the battle between the technology faction and the cultivation faction, this great sage did not appear at all. Could it be that he is that great sage? The sky god's mind raced, and he actually guessed most of the truth in the blink of an eye. After guessing this, he could not help but relax a little. Before the peace treaty was signed, even though the technology faction had been forced to occupy less than 1/10,000th of the entire universe, they were still unsettled and somewhat worried. They were worried about the great sage of the supreme divine land. As the great sage of the most powerful nation in the entire universe, before Luo Fan entered this universe, Holiness had always been the most powerful creature in the universe. He controlled the most powerful force in the universe. Moreover, this had always been for tens of billions of years, not a few years, decades, or even centuries or millennia. Such a long period of time was enough for any superpower in the entire universe to know of his existence. It was enough to form a powerful and unparalleled pressure in the hearts of all living beings in the universe who were familiar with the supreme divine land. Although the Empyrean god wasn't originally a member of a superpower, after he established a cultivation nation, he was already equivalent to a superpower. Through his understanding, he naturally knew that there was such a terrifying existence in the supreme divine land. He knew that there might be a country in the technological camp that could destroy the entire universe with its own strength. All the galaxies. A terrifying existence that could completely destroy all living beings. This type of existence's stance was unclear. For heavenly deities, this was naturally a type of formless intimidation, making them fear that the great sage would suddenly appear at any time, wishing to destroy the entire cosmos, take them down with him. Now that he had roughly guessed that the old man was the great sage, the heavenly deity finally relaxed. The pressure that was faintly present in his heart was finally completely lifted. The heavenly god was not the only one who was observing their surroundings. Except for him, Shun Tun and the others were also paying attention to their surroundings. After the heavenly god noticed the old man hovering at the edge of the vortex, the others also noticed the situation there and noticed his existence. For a moment, all kinds of guesses echoed in everyone's minds. Some people guessed the same as the heavenly god that he was the great sage, while others guessed that he was another ordinary living being in the universe. There were all kinds of strange guesses. However, no matter how much they guessed and how confused they were, no one went to wake that person up and ask him about his identity. This was because all of them were cultivators, so they knew very well that no matter who the person before them was, he was definitely a cultivator since he was able to exist here. Moreover, he was a cultivator who was obviously constantly reaping great benefits and comprehending some kind of mystery. If a cultivator in such a state was interrupted and awakened from that state of constant comprehension, it would be an irreconcilable feud of life and death. If there was no enmity between the two of them, they would not do such a thing no matter what. It was obvious that this was the first time many of them had seen this person before them. Of course, they did not have this kind of enmity with him, so they naturally could not interrupt him from that state of cultivation. Since there was no way to confirm it, they stopped after guessing for a while. After setting up some defenses, they began to look at the huge door in the center of the vortex, as well as the seemingly vast world at the edge of the door. The huge door contained all kinds of unimaginable mysteries. There was no need for anyone to remind them. They all knew this. However, they also discovered that with their current cultivation realm, it was impossible for them to comprehend the mysteries contained on the door. No matter how much effort they spent to comprehend it, the final result was that they could not understand it, but they felt that it was very powerful. Everyone made up their minds. Soon, like a holy being, they focused their attention on the similarly vast world at the foot of the door. They did their best to observe everything in that world and carefully comprehend the many mysteries contained in those things. They were different from holy beings. Although holy beings were powerful, they had also obtained the cultivation method that Luo Fan had specially created for them. However, their cultivation foundation was extremely unstable, and they lacked common knowledge about cultivation. This kind of unstable foundation and lack of general knowledge made it impossible for him to immediately discover the many mysteries contained in that continent. However, the heavenly gods and the others were different. After obtaining the common knowledge about cultivation from the god settlements, they immediately felt that the many special structures on the land contained all the principles that were compatible with common knowledge about cultivation. These principles seemed to have completely integrated all of their past understandings of cultivation, even if they were not intrinsically profound. Even though they were not intrinsically profound, they also gained something from it. This kind of gain caused all of them to instantly immerse themselves in it. They began to look like holy beings, and their expressions began to fluctuate. They began to experience all sorts of unbelievable changes at every moment. For a time, the edge of the vortex seemed to have turned into a Taoist field. Dozens of cultivators were sitting cross-legged in the air. Their auras fluctuated intensely, faintly interweaving to form a mysterious world. All sorts of strange sceneries were faintly discernible above them. Stimulated by this, the holy beings released their auras as well. They resonated with each other from afar, and all sorts of strange sceneries were faintly discernible. On the land, Luo Fan had been walking forward for a very long time outside one of the regions that were suspected to be formed by the auras of the holy beings. During this period of time, he felt as if he was walking forward along a mysterious river. With every step he took, the river would push him back a step. If he took 10 steps forward, the river would push him back 10 steps. Just like that, he would never be able to reach the source of the river. He would never be able to truly cross the river and enter the region that the river prevented him from entering. In this kind of state, he had even lost the sense of the passing of time in the outside world. Naturally, he did not notice the various things that were happening outside the vortex. This river contained almost all the mysteries between the heavens and the earth and the universe. It contained endless mysteries, making Luo Fan feel that it was extremely mysterious, extremely profound, and extremely inconceivable. However, no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't comprehend the principles within it. With every step Luo Fan took, he triggered a reaction from the river and stirred up changes in it. Through these changes, he could faintly feel some kind of subtle principles seeping into his body, fusing into his magic power, entering his mind, and being sensed by him. These principles were obscure and profound. Although he knew that he had gained something, he could not do anything about it. He could not find such gains. It was as if these gains were just an illusion. However, Luo Fan naturally knew that this was not an illusion. At his level, how could he have any illusions? What he felt was naturally a fact. Especially for the feeling that he had gained something, it was impossible to be deceived. I can't feel what kind of gain it is, which means that the profoundness of this gain is beyond my ability to understand. Only in this way, this kind of gain will not be felt by me. If it were others, they might be completely confused by such a change. But for Luo Fan, it was very clear. He instantly knew the reason why he had such an inexplicable feeling. For Luo Fan, who was now at the exceptional realm of Tao Master, the mystery that could exceed his understanding could only be achieved if he had at least stepped on the 6th or 7th level of the steps. If he had not reached that level, such as stepping on the 3rd or 4th level of the steps, then even if Luo Fan could not fully understand it, he would certainly be able to understand part of it. This was not difficult to calculate. When he encountered the battle godson who had already stepped on the 3rd level, he was able to fight with him to a stalemate. This showed that the mystery of the third level was not beyond his understanding. Just like the technology on the Earth before Luo Fan's time travel did not understand gravity at all, so they could not completely overcome gravity, here referred to as isolation. Since Luo Fan was able to withstand the attack of the third stage back then, it naturally showed that the mysteries of the third stage were not completely beyond his understanding. Understanding the various levels of mystery that he had gained, Luo Fan was secretly delighted. It did not matter if he could not understand these gains now. As long as his cultivation realm improved in the future, he would naturally understand these mysteries and naturally dig out these gains from his body again. Therefore, he didn't stop and continued to move forward. That river was grand and vast, and the power it contained was so powerful that it was beyond the limit of Luo Fan's understanding. No matter how he moved forward, no matter how firm his footsteps were, no matter how strong his power was, it easily offset his forward steps. No matter how many steps he took, he was constantly pushed back to the original position, no matter how far he felt that he had advanced. In the eyes of the outside world, he was just making no progress. This process continued without end. 1 year, 2 years, 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years. Unknowingly, tens of thousands of years had passed. On this day, at the edge of this huge whirlpool, suddenly a woman with a calm face appeared out of thin air. This woman was extremely beautiful. Her body exuded a calming aura, so that anyone who saw her would naturally become calm. Her cultivation level was extremely high, and there were all kinds of lights and shadows flashing around her. These lights and shadows seemed to show the lives of countless people. There were poor, rich, male, female, beautiful, and ugly. It was like the world was filled with all kinds of things. Like all things in the mortal world, this woman quietly floated at the edge of this whirlpool, and there seemed to be some puzzlement in her eyes. This woman was none other than Space Maiden, who had hundreds of millions of incarnations and entered the entire universe to travel. Of course, it was the same as the original Divine Creation Boy. What was here was only a collection of her incarnations. But it was not her original body. Her original body was still quietly sitting in the Creation God Temple. So how could it be here? The reason why she came here was because after so many years of cultivation with her incarnations, she thought that she had enough experience and needed to properly cultivate in seclusion to digest what she had gained over these years. So, she wanted to return to where her original body was. However, like the original problem encountered by the original Divine Creation Boy, the connection between Space Maiden's incarnations and her original body could only lead her here, to the edge of this whirlpool. But it could not lead her through this whirlpool and directly back to her original body. How could this be? The connection between the original body and the incarnations is mysterious and unfathomable. How could it be cut off? She thought. Her brows furrowed slightly. Suddenly, she raised her eyebrows, raised her hand, and gently grabbed at the void. From the void, she grabbed an extremely cute-looking girl. Little creation, where do you want to go? Why do you want to hide when you see me? The Space Maiden grabbed the girl's hand and asked with a smile. The little girl that was caught by her was naturally the boy creation god. At this moment, the Divine Creation Boy's right hand was held by the Space Maiden. He struggled hard, but could not break free. He could not help but feel a little embarrassed, and said, "Oh, it's Madam. Why is Madam here too? What a coincidence. You haven't answered me. Where do you want to go? Why are you staying here so well, and want to leave when you see me?" The Space Maiden naturally would not be perfunctory with such words, and continued to ask. "Of course not. I just want to come out and pay my respects to Madam. Why would I want to run away?" The boy creation god denied it without any hesitation. If it weren't for the fact that the Space Maiden could clearly sense that she had almost left this void layer, she would have believed him completely. "You're still lying here. I think you don't want to be controlled because I'm here." The Space Maiden stretched out her hand, grabbed the Divine Creation Boy's ear, and pulled him to her side. The essence of the Divine Creation Boy was a magic weapon of Town Master level. and this incarnation was originally more powerful than the Space Maiden. But after all, he had been partly refined by the Space Maiden, so how could he dare to resist? However, his ear was pulled over by one hand. The ear was pulled long and red, and he could only scream in pain. It hurts, madam. Please spare my life. Please spare my life." The divine creation boy cried, sounding really aggrieved, which would soften anyone who heard it. Obviously, the Space Maiden was also one of those people, so her heart softened. She let go of the divine creation boy's ear and even rubbed it and said, "Let's see if you dare to run away again. I'll let it go this time. Next time I find you, I'll ask your master to restrain you and let you have a closed-door training for hundreds of thousands of years." "I dare not. I dare not." The divine creation boy replied with extreme grievance. "Is it necessary? I just want to stay here for a few more years. I've been guarding them for tens of thousands of years, and I've been bored to death." She muttered in her heart. Although she did not show up in the past tens of thousands of years, she really stayed at the edge of the vortex, guarding the divine realm, and did not leave. For a playful child, it was extremely difficult to do this. Just now, seeing that the Space Maiden was already here, she felt that the divine realm did not need her protection. So she planned to take this opportunity to leave and play in the universe for a while. But she did not expect that her movement could not be hidden from the Space Maiden, and she was caught by the Space Maiden as soon as she moved. The Space Maiden naturally did not care about the divine creation boy's criticism in her heart. She gently stroked the divine creation boy's head and said, "Little creation, your strength is relatively high. Is there any way to contact your body?" The divine creation boy felt quite comfortable being stroked by the Space Maiden, and he shook his head with a look of enjoyment and said, "There is no way. I've tried for tens of thousands of years, and the strongest time I've tried, I could only roughly confirm that the position of the body is right in front of me, and the possible position is only accurate to 100,000th of the area of this continent. There is no way to contact the body at all. Even you can only be accurate to 100,000th. The Space Maiden could not help but sigh.